What I'm about to tell you is something I still go to therapy for. It happened back during the summer of 2009. I started going to therapy around the start of 2010, and I've been going ever since. It wasn't my idea, it was my parents'. In a way, the only reason I still go is to keep them from worrying themselves sick over me. Not that I don't derive some small benefit from it, but what I tell my parents, my therapist, and I talk about, and what we actually talk about, are two very different things. Around the start of the holiday season, back in 2008, I was a sophomore earth sciences student at UCC Davis. The university offers some summer placements to students who want to gain a little work experience. Although they're mostly dreary research assignments, I happened across one that piqued my interest in a way the others didn't. In short, I had the opportunity to spend the summer working as a fire lookout in the Trinity National Forest. It was a 3-month-long placement, but I'd be paid for my time, and completing a piece of long-term field research would look very good on my resume. I applied, I was accepted, and several months later, I was told that I'd be posted to the Tomhead Mountain Lookout, which was about 30 miles west of the city of Red Bluff and about 130 miles north of Sacramento. Since I didn't own a car back then, I had to catch a bus all the way up to Red Bluff. From there, I hitchhiked along the 36 and then hiked up into the hills until I reached the flat-topped peak of Tomhead Mountain, where the old fire lookout tower stood. The first thing that struck me was that the 20-foot-tall lookout tower was made of wood. I figured a fire lookout tower would have been built with less flammable materials, but since it had been constructed back in the 30s, I guess wood was all they had at hand. It didn't make for the best first impression. After all, that tower was supposed to be my home for the next 3 months. But in the end, I managed to get myself settled in, and the place started to feel more cozy than decrepit. A big part of the assignment involved what we call numerical weather predictions, or NWP. I won't bore you with the exact science of it, but it's somewhat similar to the kind of prediction models that allow news channels to give long-term weather forecasts. In the context of being a fire lookout, we can use these same models to predict the dry spells or heat waves that might result in a wildfire, because prevention is always better than a cure. Working on weather analysis kept me occupied for a precious few hours each day, while hydration became an important aspect of my daily routine. But outside of maintaining myself and my equipment, I had very little to keep me occupied. To kill time, I'd go for walks in the woods surrounding the lookout tower. Sometimes I'd visit the abandoned miner's cabin, sometimes the old campground that lay just beyond it. I'd keep my bear spray with me, just in case I had any close encounters of the fur kind. Haha. But I never saw any people around. At first, the seclusion was a welcome escape from the hustle and bustle of the big city. By the end of the first week, my social battery had been thoroughly recharged, but by the end of week 2, once the boredom had really started to set in, I found myself pining for human contact in a way that was very much surprising to me. I had my old Samsung cell phone with me, along with a very efficient solar-powered charger, but the lack of solid coverage meant it was more useful as a paperweight. If I walked up to this one spot on the ridgeline, I could manage to squeeze the odd text message through, but any sort of phone call was out of the question, and that was something I hadn't anticipated. It sounds foolish to think about it now, but I figured that since I was so high up on a mountain, getting decent cell reception wouldn't be an issue. In reality, it was all about proximity to towers. Communicating through the odd text message was all well and good, but by the end of that first month, being the only living soul for miles really started to grind on me. When a Trinity Forest Ranger showed up with my second month's supplies, I was so happy to see her that I almost hugged her when she stepped out of her 4x4. She could tell how happy I was to see her and joked about me going a little stir-crazy up there all on my lonesome. She was nice enough to stay a while and drink some of my bad coffee. Then, once I'd hauled my supplies from her trunk, she drove off into the sunset. After that, Knowing I wouldn't see another person in the flesh for a whole month actually made me kind of emotional. You don't realize what social animals we are until you really cut yourself off from other people. I once read that in prison, solitary confinement is one of the cruelest punishments. By the second month, I'd be out on one of my regular walks and see something move out of the corner of my eye. But then, when I turned to look, nothing. There's a lot of wildlife out there in Trinity, so for the first half dozen times it happened, I figured it was just a fox or a raccoon skittering away from me, frightened. But then, after a while, the shadows in the corners of my eyes started getting larger and clearer, until eventually they weren't just in my peripheries anymore. I'd see something moving in the trees up ahead of me, too big to be a bobcat or mountain lion, the wrong shape to be an elk or deer. I'd stop, look, listen, but nothing ever moved, nothing ever stirred. By the time I started to call out, "Hello," into the empty woods ahead of me, I had developed a genuine concern for my own psychological well-being. I tried a dozen different things to lessen the feelings of loneliness and isolation, and although talking to myself might make it sound like I'd lost my mind, I can assure you that it helped. Pouring my thoughts out onto this page helped too, as did singing my favorite songs. After a day or two of accentuating the positives and eliminating the negatives, I began to feel considerably better. But then came the day when, as I set off on one of my routine walks through the woods, I caught a glimpse of a human figure standing among the trees. I turned my head to look in their direction, and like all the other things I'd seen moving in the corner of my eyes, this person didn't dart off among the trees. Quite the opposite, in fact. They remained as still as a statue, limbs very rigid, completely unmoving. In all honesty, the person's sudden presence scared the crap out of me, and the odd, unnatural way that they were standing did not help either. But then, the more I stared at this mysterious figure, the more I realized that it wasn't a person at all. I took a few steps toward it, consumed with curiosity, only to discover that what I was looking at was some kind of wooden effigy. Someone had constructed a sort of skeleton out of wooden planks. Then, after attaching what looked to be chicken wire as a skull and rib cage, they had stuffed the cavities with a variety of dead roots and leaves. I remember being almost mesmerized by it, not because it exuded any kind of eldritch power or anything crazy like that, but because it was so exquisitely constructed. I remained in this sort of blissful state of thoughtlessness until a rather alarming thought occurred to me. That effigy had been staked into the earth less than a football field away from the lookout tower, and it almost certainly hadn't been there the previous day. That meant that someone had walked all the way up Tomhead Mountain in the middle of the night, after putting a ton of work into their curious art installation, only to stake it just meters away from where I was laying my head each night. I could think of a dozen innocent reasons why someone might do such a thing, but still, there was something about the effigy's presence that just didn't sit right with me. This probably sounds incredibly juvenile to some, but as I stood there, face to wooden face with the mysterious effigy, I was suddenly filled with the overwhelming urge to knock it over. I didn't like the idea of going about my business with this twig man just standing there, looking all creepy like he was. It's never something I do now, but I obviously can't speak for the much younger, college-age me, who raised a hand, reached out, and prepared to knock the thing off its little stubby feet. But I also remember this feeling of intense hesitation as I reached out to touch it, how it almost felt like I was desecrating some sacred sculpture. The sensation, hold me for 1 second, but in the next, it felt like a challenge. Then, with one heavy shove, I sent the effigy falling back into the dirt with a little dry thud. In the moments that followed, I felt the hairs on my arms standing on end as I was struck by the sudden cognizance that whoever planted that twig man might still actually be close by. I looked around, then over both shoulders, making sure the coast was clear. I don't believe in any kind of sixth sense, but if there ever was a time in my life when I felt like I was being watched, it was then. I decided not to finish my walk that day and headed back to the tower to make sure that I had that second can of bear mace handy. I wouldn't say that I was scared, more apprehensive of what the effigy's sudden presence might actually mean. I later considered the possibility that some renegade artist with a penchant for hiking might have mocked that thing up on the fly. At first, I had this irrational image in my head of some unhinged redneck hauling the completed effigy up the mountain like a character from an unwritten Thomas Harris novel. But, but the alternative, that it was a spur-of-the-moment creative thing, was a considerably less unnerving explanation. No one had put that thing there to spook me. They probably didn't even know that I was in the area to begin with. The more I thought about that, the more I felt strangely guilty for having shoved it over. The next morning, I decided to head out on one of my morning routines, and while I was at it, I'd stake that twig man back into the earth and just leave him upright, just as I'd found him. I completed that morning routine, jotted down a few early morning weather observations, and then set off in the direction of Tomhead Springs with some soap and a washcloth. When I reached the spot where the twig man had been lying in the dirt, I was startled to find him standing upright again. Someone had returned, possibly in the middle of the night, and had placed that twig man back in his vertical position. I wasn't outright frightened by this, just more unnerved. I also figured that if it were me who had made the twig man, this silent companion I could visit on hikes so often, I'd also be kind of bummed if some jerk came along and just pushed him over. Besides, if he was someone else's silent but stoic companion, maybe he could be mine too. I gave myself a scrub down at the springs, had made my way back to the lookout, passing the twig man as I went, and then spent the rest of the day making weather observations and reading the books that I had brought with me. Then, once the sun went down and my very early bedtime approached, I climbed into my sleeping bag and attempted to catch some shut-eye. I think I might have just been on the cusp of drifting off when a deeply alarming scent began to drift into my nostrils. It was the smell of smoke. I leapt out of my sleeping bag, threw on my shorts and boots, and was about to radio the ranger office over in Redding when a flicker of flame in the woods below caught my eye. The fire was close, very close. And by the look of things, it was still small enough for me to fight. I grabbed the tower's small fire extinguisher, rushed down the stairs, and then bolted toward the source of the fire. If I could put it out right then and there, I'd not only save the state of California hundreds of thousands of dollars, but I'd also save acres upon acres of protected forest. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, and then, when I saw what was burning, I experienced one of the strangest sensations of my entire life. It was the twig man. That's what was burning. And although I carried on hurtling toward it, I'd never seen anything so repellent in all my life. The desire to put the damn thing out and prevent a potentially massive forest fire kept propelling me through the woods. But upon considering the dual questions of who had set the twig man on fire to begin with and why, that was the first moment I felt fear. After putting out the fire, I got to thinking about who or what might be to blame. I couldn't rule out vandalism as the motive, but even the most thoughtless of vandals would think twice before setting a wildfire in a national forest. I also couldn't rule out the possibility that the person who had set the twig man on fire was the same person who put him there in the first place. I doubted very much that someone who had taken the time to create such a sculpture would also be willing to burn the entire forest down. The very nature of the twig man suggested its creator felt a reverence for nature, not a contempt for it. But in turn, that raised another question. What if Twigman's creator set him on fire because they knew I'd come running to put it out? Since I was just a few days from my second and final resupply, the same ranger who had visited me the previous month decided to head up to the mountain a little early, both to drop off my supplies and check out the remains of the twig man. When she got there and I walked her out into the woods, there wasn't much left of him to look at, but the sight of him provoked a very familiar reaction from the ranger. She had all the same questions I did, but all that mattered was that I had the fire, dealt with it quickly and professionally. In her words, I should have been very proud of myself. For the next few days, I felt perfectly content to be alone. It was like the fire and the praise I'd gotten for my decisive action had topped up my social gas tank, so to speak, satisfying that crucial third layer in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When I went on my regular walks, I didn't see any shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. I wasn't overcome by that creeping feeling that I was being watched. I felt at peace, both within and without. And that was the start of my third and final month up on the mountain. But towards the end of it, that same dread-inducing feeling that I was losing my mind returned with a vengeance. Having finished all the books that I had brought with me and having grown sick of journaling my own pressingly repetitive stream of consciousness, I was more plagued by tedium than ever. On the surface, this seemed to lead to a drastic decline in my mental health. I started seeing things again, like people moving in the woods, and the encroaching sense of paranoia resulted in a handful of completely sleepless nights. The exhaustion exacerbated every other symptom, until at one stage I started to wonder if I could complete the full 3-month term. I tried as best I could to power through, taking things one day and one night at a time, until finally, I had just 7 more nights to go. I tried to mark the occasion with a minor celebration and opened up a can of warm soda that I had been saving for a very metaphorical rainy day. Then, after an evening spent trying to keep my spirits high, I settled down to sleep. 1 down, 6 to go, I told myself. But I couldn't have been more wrong. Hours later, maybe around 1 or 2 in the morning, I opened my eyes and heard what sounded like something moving among the trees below my tower. It was a very heavy sound, like something large and bipedal was stomping through the underbrush. Seeing as that was a zoological impossibility, I decided to climb out of my sleeping bag and go take a look. Having picked up my flashlight on the way out, I aimed its beam down into the darkness below me, and in an instant, I saw them. To my horrified astonishment, I discovered that the tower I was in was surrounded by at least a dozen hooded figures. Beneath me, just out of sight at the base of the tower, was the source of the noise that I'd been hearing. As alarming as the encounter was, I didn't immediately understand the significance of the strangers' presence. There was always the possibility that they were simply a group of late-night hikers who happened across the tower and were merely curious. But when I called out to them and asked them to identify themselves, I didn't hear a word in reply. I took a few steps out and then headed down the stairs a little so I could see what was occurring at the base of the tower, which, if you remember, was only around 10 to 15 feet down. More hooded figures stood below me, and the sound they were making came from the fact that they were stacking large bales of twigs underneath the tower. It was kindling. They were going to set the tower on fire, with me inside it. The first thing I thought to do was rush back into the cabin to report what was happening via my radio. While I was doing that, I threw on my clothes and boots, grabbed my flashlight and my survival knife, then walked out onto the balcony, just in time for the fire to start. I didn't waste a second. I ran along to where the stairs were, then went down 2 or 3 flights so that the fall wouldn't break my legs. I figured I'd have to jump, as whoever was surrounding the lookout would probably be expecting me to head down the stairs once they set fire to it. Since they seemed perfectly content to roast me alive in what amounted to a very serious crime, I figured that they wouldn't be too excited about me escaping the scene. I remember jumping, knocking the wind out of myself, then being almost certain that I had just sprained an ankle until I put weight on it. Somehow, I was fine. And I also took the nearest hooded figure by surprise, which in turn gave me this brief but golden opportunity to slip past him. If I moved at speed, I honestly thought that I was about to get shot or stabbed or worse. I guess the person I ran at nearly did get me with something, but it was a stun gun. As I ran past them, they lunged at me, and I saw this little tiny bolt of lightning dancing in the air for a split second before I slipped past them and made my escape. I remember hearing a furious scream from someone, screaming about me getting away. But by then, I was long gone, half running and half sliding down the mountain as fast as I could in complete darkness. I was lucky not to fall and accidentally off myself, but there was no catching me. I made it all the way down the mountain without seeing so much as a flashlight behind me. I ran and ran until I was too tired to run anymore. Then, after what seemed like hours upon hours of rummaging through the brush, I came across a little place calling itself the Rocky Ridge Hunting Club, along with a small group of hunters preparing to take advantage of the dawn's calm. By that point, the sky was light enough that I could point out the plume of smoke rising from Tomad Mountain, and within the hour, choppers were making passes over the lookout, creating artificial rain while the ground-based fire crews rushed to the scene. I should have felt exhausted. I should have been dead on my feet. But when I saw that first chopper fly over us, heading in the direction of Tom Head, I felt 10 feet tall. I'd made it to that hunting club just in time to avert a major ecological disaster, and I felt like a hero. But I was not treated like one. Even after I explained everything that had happened, with the twig man, the hooded figures, and the fires, it was me who got the blame for burning down the Tom Head Mountain Lookout. According to the fire crews, there was no evidence of an accelerant being used, but it was impossible to tell if the source of the fire had been inside or outside the cabin. I guess it was my preposterous explanation that swayed the opinions of the Forest Service, because on their command, I was arrested on charges of arson, endangerment, and destruction of government property. My defense attorney told me that I dodged being charged with a serious environmental crime by the skin of my teeth, the kind that's only one step down from outright terrorism. She also told me that my best option by far was to basically plead temporary insanity at my trial. She made it out like I was some upstanding citizen who'd merely been unfortunate enough to have suffered a kind of psychiatric crisis as a result of severe and prolonged isolation. I pleaded guilty, got 100 hours of highway trash picking, and a mandatory psychiatric evaluation at the behest of the state of California. I tried to get my parents to believe me, but unfortunately, they took my attorney's arguments as gospel, and instead of the truth, chose to believe that I'd gone temporarily crazy. But unlike my attorney, whose interest ended once the money dried up, Mom and Dad wouldn't let it go. They hounded me until eventually I gave in and agreed to go to regular counseling sessions. I didn't want to take pills for something I knew I didn't have. So to them, therapy was the next best thing. But these days, I don't talk to my therapist about how I'm scared to lose my mind again, or how it might be a symptom of a much more frightening disease. I talk to him about how painful it can be when you tell someone the absolute truth and they choose not to believe you for the sake of their own sanity. Hi there, I'm Amber Ellis, and I was a park ranger for 8 years. I won't specify where because I don't want to get in trouble. One of the people I worked with told me to read the other park ranger stories on here, so I thought I'd give it a shot, and hell, it's good to see someone being honest. It inspired me to share some of my own stories. People need to know what happens in the woods. I quit my job a couple of years ago. I couldn't deal with bottling up all the things I've seen. Nobody wants to talk about them, but I feel like I'm drowning in the memories of it all, so I'm going to share them. I don't know if I'll be able to share everything. It might be too hard, but I'll give it a go. I hope this raises some awareness of the true dangers of the woods and makes people consider their safety. I don't want people to think I'm copying someone or making these things up. I'm just sharing my stories and experiences. Let's get into it. This was my first weird experience as a junior ranger. To this day, I still don't know what I saw, but I know it wasn't friendly. I had just received a call about screams coming from deeper in the forest, off one of the more popular trails. This wasn't unusual. If you've heard a mountain lion, you know it can sound like a woman screaming. Just as I was about to set off, my chief at the time asked to come along. I found this odd because the job seemed too insignificant for his rank, but I brushed it off. I was new and figured maybe he wanted to check my progress. We set off, making small talk, and I was obviously trying to suck up a little. We were joking around when he made a quick remark about taking even small jobs seriously because you never know what you'll find. That turned out to be some of the most valuable advice I ever got on this job, and I definitely learned my lesson later, but that's another story. We reached the area where the call originated and headed north of the trail. We heard the screams, and it sounded like a mountain lion, but something was really off about it. We kept walking toward the noise. About 10 minutes in, all of a sudden, it was like every sound was sucked out of the woods. It was dead silent. I couldn't even hear my own breathing. I thought maybe I'd gone deaf, but I looked at my chief and saw he had the same nervous expression on his face. By the way he was acting, it felt like he'd encountered this before, which I now know to be true. Just as quickly as the silence came, I started to hear a low buzzing, but it wasn't just a buzzing. I could feel it vibrating through my entire body, so much that my ears and jaw began to hurt. The best way I can describe it is like when you're getting your teeth drilled at the dentist, but worse. Even my vision started to vibrate. And as that happened, I swear I saw a black figure, about 7 feet tall, step out from behind the trees in front of me. It started letting out that same scream as it bent down and began crawling toward us. Naturally, I freaked the hell out and stepped back to run. My chief grabbed my arm, hard, almost knocking me over, and put his other arm around me as he began to walk me out of the forest. Just as I was about to fight him and yell for us to run, he said in a calm voice, "Don't run. Don't talk. Don't look back. Just keep walking." I did exactly what he said. He obviously knew something I didn't, and as much as I wanted to run, I didn't want to find out what would happen if I did. Those 10 minutes were excruciating. I could tell it was crawling behind us by the buzzing in my head and the faint wailing sound it made. I wanted to run so badly. Eventually, I think it ran off because all the regular noise of the forest came back, and the buzzing stopped. When we got back on the trail, I was shaking. I was in such shock I couldn't even cry. He let go of me and started walking back to the main base without saying a word about what had happened. I started screaming at him, asking what the hell that thing was. He said, and yes, I remember this word for word, "There are things in these woods that have been here longer than us, things we can't explain or get rid of. If you don't think you can handle that, you should pack your bags now." He kept walking, and I followed behind, trying to make sense of what had happened. I obviously stayed in the job. When it was good, it was really good. I met some amazing people and I loved nature. But in the end, the bad experiences outweighed the good, and I had to leave. Honestly, I wish I had left when he told me to pack my bags. I know this experience doesn't sound that scary in writing, but trust me, living through it was terrifying. And there are worse ones. Some of them are scarier, some are more explainable. I'm still debating whether to share all my stories. Maybe I'll see how I feel after posting this. I'd love to hear other people's experiences with the woods. Part 2. A lot of people seem to be interested in stairs found in the woods. I've seen a set of stairs in the woods once, and personally it wasn't too scary. Just a bit creepy. I know a couple of my friends in the force, a force to be reckoned with, have some stories about stairs that they've mentioned in passing. If and when I decide to contact them for permission, maybe I'll post those. I do, however, have a story about a ladder that I wish I could forget, because just thinking about it gives me the creeps. My experience with the stairs is pretty tame, so I'll add another incident afterward. We were searching for a young girl who had wandered off. We found her. She's fine. The team was stretched out pretty far, so I was walking alone but within shouting distance of others. As I was walking, I saw a set of stairs. They sort of looked like they belonged there but also didn't. They were overgrown, like they might have been the steps to someone's house, but I realized there was no way someone had put them there recently. I figured I'd stumbled upon one of those mysterious stairs my coworkers had talked about. I thought I'd be terrified if I ever saw them, but I wasn't. I did, however, feel an urge to walk up them, like something was pulling me toward them. Maybe it was just the excitement of finally seeing them, or maybe something darker. Someone nearby called out that they'd found something, and it snapped me back to reality. I'm really glad they did. I'm not sure what would have happened if I'd gone up. We found the girl, and all was well. On the way back, I mentioned to a partner that I had seen some stairs. She got worried and sort of grilled me about whether I touched or walked up them. I said no, and that was it. So yeah, pretty tame. Nothing too intense. I'm not going to lie or overemphasize anything here. This next occurrence isn't about stairs, but it is about a ladder, which I'd say is pretty similar. This happened sometime during my first year as a park ranger, around the start of summer when poison ivy really goes wild. We had to do weekly checks on the trails and the surrounding brush. My partner and I were assigned to check some of the less popular trails. We came to a smaller trail that forked for a couple of minutes and then joined up again. Being the idiots we were, we split up, planning to meet where it connected. We could still see each other through the brush in the middle, so we thought it was fine. He took the left path, and I took the right. As I was walking, keeping an eye out for ivy, I caught something in the corner of my eye, a large clearing in the middle of the trees. It looked man-made, perfectly round, as if someone had been maintaining it. There wasn't a single tree, bush, or even a weed. I was so focused on the lack of vegetation that I almost didn't notice the huge, unmistakable ladder standing right in the center. It was upright and leaning against absolutely nothing, like some unknown force was holding it. I looked up and saw a man at the top wearing a business suit. It almost seemed comical, like he'd walked straight out of a corporate office. His head was tilted back, staring up at the sky, and his mouth was wide open. I couldn't get a clear view, so I called to him a few times. No response. I circled the ladder, looking for wires or strings, hoping it was some sort of prank or art installation, but I found nothing. He looked like he was on display for some bizarre exhibition. I didn't know what else to do, and I couldn't see my partner, so I radioed him to come over. While waiting, I made the stupid decision to touch the ladder. I know, terrible idea. Don't touch weird crap you find in the woods. I got a weird feeling just before my hand reached it, but I brushed it off and touched it anyway. The moment I did, the man at the top snapped his neck in this horrifically contorted way to look at me and let out an ungodly gasp, like he was drawing his last breath. His face was still warped in this gaping expression, eyelids and lips pulled back as though he were in perpetual shock. I stumbled back and grabbed my taser. Just then, I heard someone behind me and I spun around, taser raised. It was my partner, hands in the air to avoid getting tased. When I looked back, the ladder was flat on the ground and the man was gone. My partner asked what was going on, so I explained and begged him not to think I was crazy. Of course he didn't. He knew as well as I did that weird stuff like this happens more often than you think. We had to do a quick search for the guy, protocol, which I hated. I was praying we wouldn't find him. We didn't. I never saw anything like that again, and neither has anyone I've talked to. That guy was balancing on top of a ladder that wasn't leaning against anything. Maybe I met Houdini. When you see stuff like that, you make jokes, or you'll never move on. I'm really glad people are enjoying what I have to say. I'm not sure when I'll write more. Don't expect too much because this is both tiring and cathartic. I'm thinking of sharing some of the less spooky stories and the ones that are just about humans being weird. We'll see. I had done this 100 times before. Searching for missing campers was part of my job as a park ranger, and honestly, it usually ended with someone just lost or confused. But this time felt different from the start. My name is Ethan Harper, and I've been a ranger at Eagle's Shadow National Park for over 10 years. The place is vast, miles of dense forest, winding rivers, and jagged cliffs. It's beautiful, sure, but unforgiving if you don't know your way. Daniel Clean, the missing camper, had been out there for 3 days now. He hadn't left a single trace behind, which was strange. Most of the time, lost hikers left footprints, scraps of food wrappers, or at least a trail of some sort. But not Daniel. It was as if he had just disappeared. My team for this mission was small but solid. There was Sarah Morales, my second in command and one of the best rangers I knew. Calm under pressure, smart, and someone I could always count on. Then there was Dr. Greg Owens, the park's biologist. He wasn't much of a hiker, but he knew the wilderness like the back of his hand. Jake Donnelly and Mia Caldwell rounded out the team, 2 younger rangers, both eager but pretty green. I wasn't thrilled about taking rookies this deep into the forest, but I didn't have a choice. We set out in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the towering pines. As we hiked deeper into the Whispering Pines section of the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the thick, almost suffocating silence that blanketed the area. It was more than that. An unspoken tension hung in the air, like the forest itself was watching us. "Ethan, look at this," Sarah called out, breaking the silence. I turned to see her crouching over some animal tracks, but there was something wrong with them. They led a few feet into the underbrush, and then nothing. The prints just stopped, as if whatever made them had been lifted straight into the air. "That's not possible," Greg muttered, scratching his head. He bent down to examine the tracks more closely, but even he didn't have an answer. No predator out here could do that. It doesn't make sense. We pressed on, though the unease was starting to settle in my gut. The deeper we ventured into the forest, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the wind, just silence. And that silence felt wrong. The first real scare came when Jake froze in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Hear what?" I asked, scanning the trees around us. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "A cry. It sounded like someone calling for help," Jake said, his face pale. "But it didn't sound right." "Probably just the wind," I said, as was trying to keep things calm. But inside, I knew something wasn't right. The wind hadn't made a sound all day. We finally reached Daniel's campsite just before the sun dipped below the horizon. His tent was still there, untouched. His supplies were all in order. It didn't make any sense. If Daniel had left, he hadn't taken anything with him. His backpack, his food, even his water bottle. Everything was still in place. "Why would he leave without his gear?" Mia asked, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't have an answer for her. None of this added up. People don't just vanish without a trace. "We'll set up camp here for the night," I said, though I didn't like the idea of staying in this place any more than they did. "We'll keep searching in the morning." As we began to settle in, the light faded, and the forest seemed to change around us. The shadows grew longer, darker, as if they were creeping closer to our camp. Sarah sat by the fire, staring out into the trees. Suddenly, she stood up, her eyes wide. "I saw something," she said, her voice shaky. "Out there, a figure. It was watching us." I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the tree line. Nothing, just endless trees stretching into the darkness. "Maybe it's Daniel," Jake suggested, though he didn't sound too sure. "Or maybe it's something else," Mia whispered, barely loud enough to hear. The air had grown colder, now the fire flickering weakly against the increasing chill. That's when we heard it. The first howl started low and distant, like the wind. But then it grew. It was a deep, guttural wail, almost human, but warped and wrong. It echoed through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. "Stay close," I ordered, gripping my flashlight tighter. But deep down, I wasn't sure staying close was going to be enough. This wasn't just a search anymore. Something was out there with us. And whatever it wasn't human. I didn't sleep much that night. None of us did. That strange howl echoed through the trees for hours, low and haunting, like something was calling out to us. We huddled by the fire, trying to convince ourselves it was just an animal, maybe a wolf or a coyote, but deep down, I think we all knew better. By morning, the fire had burned down to embers and the forest was eerily quiet again. Too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. The kind of silence that made your skin crawl. I glanced at Sarah, who was rubbing her arms, her eyes darting to the tree line every few seconds. "We should keep moving," she said, her voice low. "I don't like staying here." I nodded in agreement. The sooner we found Daniel, the better. The campsite had given us no answers, only more questions. Why would he leave his gear? Where did he go? And what was that awful sound we kept hearing? Jake, looking paler than usual, kicked dirt over the fire to put it out. "What do you think it was last night?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but the edge in his voice gave him away. "Just the wind," I lied. But Jake didn't look convinced. Neither was I. As we packed up, Greg tapped me on the shoulder. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the trees surrounding our campsite. I followed his gaze, and my stomach dropped. Deep claw marks gouged the bark, long and jagged. They weren't there when we arrived last night. That doesn't look like anything I've seen before," Greg said, his voice shaking a little. "Too big for any animal around here." I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. Let's not jump to conclusions. Could have been a bear. But even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. Bears didn't come this far into the forest, and these marks were way too big, too deep. We set off again, moving deeper into the whispering pines. But the deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in on us. The trees here were taller, their thick branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. Everything was dim, shadowy, like the woods were swallowing us whole. Hours passed, but we hadn't found a single clue about Daniel's whereabouts. Just more silence. And then out of nowhere, Jake stopped dead in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, looking around wildly. I frowned. "Hear what?" Someone calling for help," he said, his face pale. It sounded like Daniel. We all stopped, listening, but I couldn't hear anything. "Jake, are you sure?" I asked, even though I knew the answer. "I swear, Ethan, I heard him," he insisted, his hands trembling. He was calling my name. I exchanged a glance with Sarah. Something wasn't right. Jake was jumpy. Too jumpy, and it was starting to get to the others. Ingrid said, "Maybe you're just hearing things, Jake," I said gently, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "We're all tired." Jake shook his head furiously. "No, I heard him. He's out there." "Let's keep moving," Sarah said, her voice tense. "Standing around here isn't going to help." Reluctantly, Jake fell in line, but I could tell he was still on edge, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes like he was expecting something or someone to jump out of the shadows. As we trekked further into the forest, the trees grew thicker, darker. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. I could feel the tension rising in the group, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves making us all jump. I tried to stay focused, but the forest seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. It was like we were being led in circles. And then, just as I was starting to think we'd never find our way out, Jake gasped and pointed ahead. "There! Do you see him?" We all looked, but I didn't see anything at first, just trees, shadows, and the dim light filtering through the branches. But then there was a figure, far off, just barely visible between the trees. "Daniel," I called out, taking a step forward. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, still and silent. I took another step, but Sarah grabbed my arm. "Ethan, wait, something's wrong." She was right. The figure, it wasn't acting like a person. Its posture was off, that twisted in a way that made my stomach turn. And its eyes, they were black, completely black. No whites, no pupils, just empty, soulless darkness. My blood ran cold. "Jake, stay back," I warned. But Jake wasn't listening. He was already moving toward the figure, calling Daniel's name. "Jake, stop," I shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching us, its dark eyes locked onto mine. Then, in an instant, it vanished, disappearing into the trees like it had never been there. "What the hell was that?" Greg whispered, his face pale. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we needed to get out of this forest. Fast. Something was out there. Something that wasn't Daniel, and it was watching us. We didn't talk much after that, not even Jake, who had been rattling on all day about seeing Daniel. Now he just walked in silence, his eyes darting from tree to tree like he was expecting something to jump out at him. And honestly, I couldn't blame him. I had seen it too. That twisted figure with its black, soulless eyes. The sun was starting to set again, and the shadows in the forest stretched longer, darker, until they seemed to blur together. We needed to make camp soon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that stopping would be a mistake. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to keep moving, to get out of this cursed place as fast as possible. But the others were exhausted, and the deeper we went into the whispering pines, the more it felt like we were going in circles. "We need to stop," Sarah said, her voice strained. "We can't keep going in the dark." I wanted to argue, but she was right. We were all worn out, and continuing blindly through the night would only make things worse. So we found a small clearing and set up camp. I made sure the fire was big, bigger than usual. Something about the light made me feel safer, even if it was just an illusion. As we sat around the fire, the silence felt heavier than ever. Jake hadn't said a word since we saw that thing in the trees. Greg was scribbling notes in his journal, though I couldn't imagine what he thought he was going to explain. And Sarah, she just stared into the flames, her face pale and drawn. "What do you think it was?" Mia finally asked, breaking the tension. I didn't want to answer, but I knew I had to. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but it wasn't Daniel." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "It looked like him, though, didn't it?" I shook my head. "It might have looked like him, but that wasn't human. No way." Greg cleared his throat, looking up from his notes. "There are stories, legends about creatures in the forest, things that can mimic humans. Skinwalkers, I think they're called." "Skinwalkers?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "Like from those old Navajo stories?" Greg nodded. "They can take the form of people, animals, whatever they want. It's said they use voices to lure people in." "That's just a myth," Sarah cut in, her tone sharp. "Stories to scare kids around the campfire." "Maybe," Greg said. But what we saw out there, it fits the description." Before we could debate it further, a voice broke through the silence. "Help! Help me!" We all froze. It was a woman's voice calling out from the trees, and not just any voice. Mia's voice. We turned to Mia, who sat with us by the fire, her face draining of all color. That's my voice," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. The voice called out again, sounding even closer this time. "Please help me. I'm lost." I stood up, heart pounding in my chest. "Stay close to the fire," I warned the others. "It's trying to trick us." "But it sounds so real," Mia whispered, her hands shaking. "How can it sound exactly like me?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but we're not going anywhere." The voice continued, now circling our camp, calling for help in Mia's voice, each time more desperate than the last. But we stayed put, huddled by the fire, refusing to be lured into the dark. And then, without warning, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. For a few minutes, no one moved, no one spoke. We just sat there, listening to the crackling fire and the eerie quiet of the forest. And then, out of nowhere, Mia screamed. We all turned to see her being dragged away into the darkness, her legs kicking wildly, her hands clawing at the ground. Her scream echoed through the trees, and then, just like that, it was replaced by an awful, twisted version of her own voice, calling back to us. "Help! Help me! I'm lost." I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward where Mia had been dragged, but there was nothing. No sign of her, just more of that horrible silence. And the sound of her voice, no, the creature's voice, calling out from deeper in the forest. "It's playing with us." Sarah whispered, her face pale. "It's taking us one by one." I felt panic rising in my chest, but I pushed it down. "We need to get to the old watchtower," I said, my voice firm. "If there's any chance of getting help, that's our best shot." Greg looked doubtful. "What makes you think we'll make it?" "We don't have a choice," I snapped, trying to keep control of the situation. "It's either that or we sit here and wait for it to come back." Sarah nodded, standing up. "Ethan's right. We need to move." We packed up quickly, the fire still burning behind us as we plunged back into the darkness of the forest. The creature's voice followed us the entire way, calling our names in familiar voices, always just out of sight. But no matter how fast we moved, I could feel it closing in. We were being hunted, and I had no idea how we were going to survive. We made it to the old watchtower just as the last light of the day faded behind the mountains. The wooden structure loomed above us, tall and weathered, with broken windows and a door that hung crooked on its hinges. It wasn't much, but it was our only chance. I wasn't even sure if the radio inside still worked, but right now it was better than being out in the open with that thing stalking us. "Get inside, quick!" I ordered, pushing Jake and Sarah through the door. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the creature right behind us, but the forest was eerily still. That was the worst part. The waiting. It was toying with us, and we all knew it. We barricaded the door with an old wooden beam, then piled up whatever we could find, broken chairs, an old desk, anything that might slow it down. Sarah rushed to check the radio, but from the look on her face, I could tell it wasn't good. "It's dead," she muttered, kicking the useless machine in frustration. "No power. No signal. We're trapped." Jake sat down in the corner, his hands shaking. "We're not going to make it, are we?" "We will," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "We just need to hold out until morning." But even as I said the words, the whispering began. At first it was faint, like wind slipping through the cracks in the walls, but then it grew louder, more distinct. Voices, familiar voices. "Ethan." It was Mia's voice, soft and pleading, coming from just outside of the door. "Ethan, please help me." My heart raced. I knew it wasn't really her, but hearing her voice so close, so desperate, made it hard to think straight. The others heard it too. Jake's eyes were wide with fear, and even Sarah looked shaken. "It's not real," Sarah said firmly, as if trying to convince herself. "It's just the creature trying to trick us." But the voices didn't stop. Now Greg was calling out, his voice sounding broken and pained. "Ethan, help me. It's too dark." I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles white. The whispers circled the tower, growing louder, more insistent. And then something began scratching at the door. Slow, deliberate scrapes, like claws dragging along the wood. "It's here," Jake whispered, his face pale. He was shaking uncontrollably now, curled up in the corner, rocking back and forth. "It's here." "Stay calm," I told him, though my own heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear myself think. "It can't get in, not with the door barricaded." But the scratching grew louder. It sounded like nails raking across the wood. And then the voices began again, this time in Sarah's voice. "Ethan, let me in." I shot a glance at Sarah, who was standing by the window, her eyes wide with terror. That's my voice," she whispered, backing away from the wall. The creature was taunting us, using our own voices against us, and the fear in the room was rising by the second. Jake was nearly hysterical, and even Sarah, who had always been the strongest, was starting to crumble. "We can't stay here," I said finally, my voice tight with panic. "It's only a matter of time before it gets in." "How?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling. "We can't outrun it. We can't fight it." I didn't have an answer, but I knew we had to do something. Sitting here, waiting for the creature to break through, was suicide. Then an idea hit me. It was desperate, but it might just work. "Distract it," I said suddenly, looking at Sarah. "I'll distract it, draw it away from the door while you and Jake make a run for it." "No way," Sarah protested. "You're not going out there alone." "I have to," I said firmly. "It's the only way. If I can draw it far enough away, you might be able to slip past it and make it to the ranger station. There's another radio there. If it still works, you can call for help." Sarah looked torn, but she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "But you come back. Promise me." "I'll try," I said, though I knew it was a promise I might not be able to keep. With one last deep breath, I unblocked the door, the scratching growing louder the moment I touched the beam. The voices stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl from the other side. It was waiting for me. I threw the door open and sprinted into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I could hear the creature behind me, its footsteps fast and heavy, chasing me through the trees. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. "Come on," I yelled, my voice hoarse. "You want me? Here I am." I heard a snarl, close now. too close. My legs burned, but I pushed harder, darting between the trees, trying to lead it away from the watchtower. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure running alongside me. It was the creature. Its body shifted, its face twisted, until it looked just like me. For the first time in my life, I felt true terror. It was wearing my face, and then it lunged.
My name's Brian Patel, and this happened to me in the National Forest in Oregon. I grew up in Portland and spent most weekends hiking the trails with my dad. After he passed away, I kept the tradition alive, even though the solitude wasn't quite the same. I wasn't the sentimental type, but being out there brought some quiet to my otherwise loud, chaotic life as an electrician. That particular weekend, and I'd planned a 2-day solo trek, something to clear my head and test out some new gear. I wasn't an ultralight fanatic or anything, but I liked keeping things minimal. Just me, the trail, and whatever nature threw at me. My route started at Timberline Lodge and cut through some backcountry trails that didn't see much traffic. It was early morning when I set out, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a map in the other. The first few hours were uneventful. The trails were damp from rain earlier in the week, and the scent of pine mixed with the occasional waft of mushrooms kept things pleasant. Around noon, I passed an older couple hiking with trekking poles. They waved but didn't stop to chat, which was fine by me. Solitude was the point. It was late afternoon when I noticed the first odd thing. I'd stopped at a clearing to refill my water from a nearby creek. The silence was too perfect. No birds, no rustling, nothing. It wasn't unusual for animals to scatter when a human came stomping through, but this was eerie, like the forest was holding its breath. I joked to myself that maybe I'd finally reached that perfect peace people were always yapping about in self-help books. As I climbed higher into the denser part of the forest, the feeling lingered. Every so often, I'd hear a snapping twig or see a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, but I chalked it up to squirrels or deer. That changed when I reached the ridge. There was a campsite up there, or at least what was left of one. A collapsed tent lay flattened against the dirt, its poles bent at odd angles. Gear was scattered around like someone had emptied a backpack in a panic. What caught my attention was the cooler, one of those sturdy, bear-resistant kinds. Its lid was wrenched open, and deep claw marks gouged the plastic. I didn't recognize the pattern. It didn't look like bear claws. Whatever did it had talons. I poked around cautiously. A jacket with a name tag, Franklin, hung on a low branch, ripped down the middle like someone had tried to peel it off. That's when I saw the blood. Not a lot, but enough to know something had gone wrong. My stomach tightened. I didn't consider myself squeamish, but the combination of the silence and the blood made the air feel heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I didn't linger. I wasn't about to play hero and investigate further, but I also didn't want to turn back the way I'd come. The campsite had a bad vibe, and if someone was injured, I wasn't eager to meet whatever or whoever had caused it. I decided to push forward toward a secondary trailhead about 5 miles out. It wasn't on my original route, but it would get me out of there quicker. The trail narrowed as I descended into a gully. Thick undergrowth swallowed most of the light, and the temperature seemed to drop. My boots squelched in the damp earth as I pushed past ferns that slapped against my legs. About halfway down, I caught a foul odor, like rotting meat mixed with damp fur. My first thought was a dead animal, maybe a cougar kill left to rot, but it was strong enough to make my eyes water. Then I heard it, a low, deep rumbling noise that didn't sound natural. It wasn't a growl, but it wasn't mechanical either. It reverberated through the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint the direction. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I chose the third option, freeze. I crouched low, scanning the trees, my heart hammering in my chest. The noise came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of heavy footsteps. I forced myself to move, creeping forward as quietly as possible. The trail curved ahead, and just as I rounded the bend, I saw it, or at least part of it. A massive, hulking shape loomed through the trees, crouched over something on the ground. Its limbs were grotesquely long, the joints bending in ways that didn't make sense. It had patches of wiry fur mottled with bare, pale skin. What struck me most was its posture, like a predator that had evolved to ambush. I stayed hidden behind a tree, trying not to breathe. Whatever it was feeding, its movements jerky and almost insect-like. The thing was tearing into something unrecognizable, its talons slicing through flesh with surgical precision. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to retch. The smell was overwhelming. A sudden snap of a branch underfoot betrayed me. The creature's head shot up, swiveling unnaturally as it scanned for the source of the noise. I didn't get a clear view of its face, but I did see its teeth, rows of uneven, serrated spikes that looked like they belonged in a shark, not on land. I bolted. Stealth be damned. I sprinted down the trail, branches clawing at my face and arms. The sound of pursuit was immediate, heavy footfalls crashing through the undergrowth. I didn't dare look back. My pack jostled against my shoulders as I weaved through the narrow trail, adrenaline pushing me faster than I thought possible. The trail forked ahead, and I veered left without thinking. Bad move. The path led to a dead end, a sheer drop-off into a ravine. My options were limited. Jump and risk breaking something, or turn and face the thing head-on. Neither seemed appealing. I scrambled up a boulder, hoping to gain some height and buy myself time. The creature burst through the trees moments later, its gangly frame silhouetted against the dim light. Up close, it was worse. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, and its movements were unnervingly smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. It paused, tilting its head as if deciding whether I was worth the effort. I fumbled for the small knife in my pocket, knowing it was more symbolic than anything. The creature lunged forward, and I did the only thing I could. I threw my pack at it. The motion startled it, and it recoiled briefly, giving me enough time to leap down the side of the ravine. I tumbled hard, dirt and rocks tearing at my clothes as I slid to the bottom. My ankle twisted painfully, but I managed to scramble to my feet. The creature didn't follow immediately, but I could hear it pacing above, its claws scraping against the rocks as it searched for another way down. I limped through the ravine, following the trickle of water downstream. My only thought was to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. The ravine eventually opened up into a clearing, and I spotted a ranger's cabin in the distance. Relief surged through me, though it was tempered by the realization that I wasn't out of the woods yet, literally or figuratively. The cabin was locked, but I found an axe leaning against the woodpile. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I crouched low, gripping the axe and scanning the tree line. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, every rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. When it came, it was sudden. The creature barreled into the clearing, moving faster than seemed possible for its lanky frame. I swung the axe as it charged, catching it in the shoulder. The impact staggered it, but the thing didn't go down. It lashed out with its talons, grazing my arm and drawing blood. We circled each other, predator and prey, roles blurring. I swung again, aiming for its head this time. The blade connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature let out a piercing screech. It collapsed, twitching violently before going still. I didn't stick around to admire my handiwork. With my arm bleeding and my ankle screaming in pain, I limped back toward the trailhead, keeping an eye on the shadows. I flagged down the first car I saw, a bewildered couple who probably thought I'd lost my mind. Years later, I avoid Mount Hood. Not because I'm scared, but because I've learned to stick to places where nature follows the rules, or at least pretends to. I'm going to be honest with you. Being a cop in a small town isn't glamorous. It's not like the movies where every day is a shootout or a high-speed chase. It's mostly handling neighbor disputes over where someone's fence ends or someone's dog barking too much. My name's Lucas Giroux, and I've been wearing the badge for 9 years here in Chesterville, Louisiana. Population about 2,000, give or take. I love this town. It's quiet, peaceful for the most part, and I like that. My days are usually filled with mundane tasks, which suits me just fine. I didn't sign up to be some action hero, but that was before what happened in 2014. That night, everything changed. Chesterville sits on the edge of Lake Vere, a slow-moving body of water surrounded by cypress trees and swampland. People here fish, drink, and go about their lives. It was a pretty uneventful Thursday evening. I was sitting in the patrol car near the lake, enjoying the last of my coffee. That's when the call came through. Domestic disturbance, 14 miles out of town, near the edge of the bayou. Some old shack out there. Probably a drunk couple having a fight. I sighed, thinking about how cold my coffee was going to get by the time I got back. I could have ignored the call. In a town this small, people mostly resolve their issues on their own. But it's my job, and I'm not the kind of guy to leave a job half done. So I punched the gas and headed toward the edge of the swamp, the smell of rotting vegetation creeping into the car through the vents. The air always smells different out there. Heavy, like something's growing in the darkness. The address was off the main road, way off. I had to take a gravel path that was barely wide enough for my cruiser, with branches scraping against the sides like they were trying to keep me from going any further. The place was almost hidden behind thick trees, vines practically choking the building itself. It was an old, decaying wooden structure, more of a cabin than a house. When I stepped out of the car, everything felt wrong. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, but I shook it off. Maybe I was just on edge because it was so quiet. And in a town where quiet usually means safety, this felt different, like something was waiting. I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. That's when I heard it, a scraping noise from inside, something heavy being dragged across the floor. I called out, "Chesterville PD, anyone home?" Still nothing. Now, I've dealt with drunks, domestic fights, and all sorts of noise complaints, but the sound coming from inside wasn't something I'd heard before. My hand instinctively went to my gun as I tried the doorknob. Locked. I circled the cabin, looking for another way in, when I noticed something strange, a set of footprints leading around the back. But not human ones. These prints were larger, clawed, like some kind of animal. But whatever made them was walking on two legs, and they were fresh. I was starting to think this wasn't just some domestic dispute. I followed the prints, feeling a chill in the pit of my stomach. As I reached the back of the cabin, I saw the door was ajar, hanging on its hinges. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell, like rotting meat mixed with damp earth. The cabin was small, just one room, with a dirty mattress on the floor and a table covered in old newspapers. But what caught my eye was the blood. It was smeared across the floor, thick and dark, leading to a corner where something was slumped. I shone the flashlight on it. It was a man, or what was left of him. His body had been torn apart, like he'd been mauled by something much bigger than any animal I'd ever seen in these parts. His chest was ripped open, ribs exposed, and his face, well, there wasn't much left to recognize. I barely had time to process the scene when I heard that same dragging noise again, but closer this time, coming from behind me. I turned, heart racing, and shone the light toward the sound. Something was moving in the shadows. Something big. At first I thought it was a bear, but bears don't move like that, and they sure as hell don't stand on two legs. It stepped into the light and I froze. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, with matted fur and a face that looked almost human, but twisted, distorted, like something halfway between a person and a wolf. Its claws were long, too long for anything natural, and its mouth was smeared with blood, teeth glistening like knives. I didn't hesitate. I drew my gun and fired, emptying the magazine into the thing's chest. But it barely flinched. The bullets hit, sure, but they didn't seem to do much more than piss it off. It let out this low sound, like it was irritated more than hurt, and took a step toward me. I backed up, reloading as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I've never been a great shot, but at this range, it didn't seem to matter. Nothing was going to stop this thing. It lunged. I dove out of the way, crashing into a shelf that sent bottles and cans scattering across the floor. My head was spinning, but I managed to scramble to my feet and run for the door. I don't know how, but I made it back to the car, slamming the door shut just as it slammed into the side of the cruiser, rocking it on its wheels. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning in the mud as I gunned it back down the gravel path. The thing didn't follow me. It just stood there in the rearview mirror, watching. As I sped away, its shape slowly faded into the darkness of the swamp. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I had to call it in. But what the hell was I going to say? That some kind of monster tore a man apart and nearly killed me? I thought about it for a long moment, staring at the radio, before deciding to do something I never thought I'd do. I lied. When I called it in, I said I found the man already dead. Looked like some kind of animal attack. Maybe a bear, maybe a wild dog. Hell, maybe both. I didn't mention the thing I saw. I couldn't. No one would believe me. I barely believed it myself. But here's the thing. I wasn't the only one out there that night. I found out later that 2 fishermen had been on the lake, close enough to the cabin to hear the gunshots. They saw something too. Something large, moving through the trees. They didn't get a good look at it, but they said it wasn't a bear. Wasn't anything they'd ever seen before. And they swore it walked on 2 legs. The next morning, I went back out there with the sheriff and a couple of deputies. We found the body, or what was left of it, but there was no sign of the creature. Just those same strange tracks leading off into the swamp. The sheriff wrote it up as an animal attack, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew something didn't add up. I've thought about that night a lot since then, about how close I came to ending up like that poor bastard in the cabin, and about what's still out there, lurking in the swamp. Some nights, when it's real quiet, I wonder if it's still watching. But I've learned not to go looking for answers. Sometimes, in a place like this, it's better to let the mysteries stay buried. I pulled into the campground just before sunset, expecting the usual, a few quiet families roasting marshmallows, maybe a couple of seasoned hikers turning in early. Instead, I was greeted by the clamor of loud music echoing off the tree line. The source? A cluster of tents circled around a blazing fire where a group of frat boys hollered and laughed like they had the whole place to themselves. Every so often, other campers peeked out of their tents, uneasy and clearly wishing guys would tone it down. I couldn't blame them. Noise doesn't just shatter the calm of a campsite, it draws attention from things best left undisturbed. Out here, folks whisper about the ghost cats, those local mountain lions known to slip into camps without warning. I'd seen enough tracks in eerily close proximity to sleeping bags to know these stories were more than just rumors. I parked my rig a little ways off and walked over, picking my path carefully around scattered coolers and folding chairs. As I got close, the frat boys paused their banter, giving me that half-attentive look. They were mostly older teens or early 20-somethings, still buzzing with alcohol and late-night bravado. Evening, I started, trying to keep it friendly but firm. I'm the ranger on duty. Got some other campers worried you're attracting unwanted attention. I motioned toward the looming tree line. These woods have a reputation, and it's not for the best sing-alongs. They laughed it off at first, so I leaned in, lowering my voice. I described how mountain lions sometimes stalk the perimeter of noisy camps, how you won't spot them until they're practically brushing against your tent walls. I explained how we call them ghost cats because of their uncanny silence, the way they seem to appear out of nowhere. They sobered up a bit. A couple exchanged uncertain glances, but one just shrugged, muttering that they'd keep it down. I issued a final warning anyway. Stay quiet, don't wander off, and if you hear anything odd outside in the dark, make no sound. I only hoped they'd actually listen. Once I'd done all I could, I headed back to the station. My buddy Jim was there, flipping through some old wildlife photos. He raised an eyebrow when I told him about the frat boys. Let me guess, blasting music, ignoring every rule we've got, right? He said, clearly unimpressed. Bingo, I replied. And they're not taking the mountain lion threat seriously. He let out a quiet laugh that contained zero humor. We both knew this was more than a minor annoyance. If something did happen, we'd be the ones hauling them out, or dealing with an injured cat that got too comfortable around humans. That's when we started talking about a plan. Not to harm anyone, obviously, but to rattle them enough that they'd finally grasp the gravity of a place like this. Jim reminded me about the old lion pelt in our interpretive center. Used it once or twice for educational tours, though it always gave me the creeps. Its glass eyes caught the light in this unnerving way, like it was still alive. We also had night vision goggles stashed away, thanks to a budget splurge before the new fiscal year. Perfect for sneaking around in the dark, unseen by unsuspecting campers. Over the next half hour, we pieced together a strategy: fake prints, hidden growls, and a well-timed appearance of a lion silhouette. It might just be the jolt they needed to pack up, or at the very least, dial down the party volume. Grabbing the pelt from a dusty storage closet, I noticed the faint, musty smell of fur mixed with something almost medicinal. I ran my hand over the stiff mane, shivering at how realistic it still felt. Next, we tested the night vision goggles. Even in the dim station lights, they turned everything into an eerie green that made my pulse spike. By the time we had our gear ready, the sun had slipped below the horizon. The woods outside transformed into a dark maze. I had this sense that the frat boys, oblivious in their tents, were about to discover that being out here isn't just a carefree getaway. If they refused to respect the campground's unspoken rules, well, we'd give them a night they wouldn't forget. Jim killed the overhead lights as we locked up. We checked our plan one last time, and I took a breath, settling my nerves. We were about to sneak into that campsite, loaded with props and a fair share of wild imagination. In the back of my mind, I thought about the actual ghost cats prowling these hills. I hoped we wouldn't run into a real one while pulling our prank. It's one thing to frighten a few campers. It's another to come face to face with the genuine article. Still, I felt this rush of adrenaline as we set off into the darkness. Maybe it was the satisfaction of delivering a wake-up call. Or maybe it was just that strange, hushed energy you feel whenever you realize you're not at the top of the food chain out here. Either way, there was no turning back. We had our plan, and we were committed to seeing it through. The night was only getting darker, and the silent woods seemed to hold their breath, waiting for whatever came next. I hunched down in the cramped front seat of our Jeep, double-checking that the lion pelt was still tucked out of sight. Outside, moonlight drenched the forest in faint silver, and every rustle of wind through the branches made me brace for actual movement. I couldn't help scanning the dark spaces between the trees, searching for any flicker of eyes that might belong to the real thing. My coworker Jim was fidgeting in the passenger seat, adjusting the small PA system we'd use for the recorded roars. "Ready?" he asked, voice low. "As I'll ever be," I replied, half hoping those frat kids were already asleep and half itching to put our plan into action. Either way, we needed to move quickly. The night sky was starless, and visibility would only get worse. I eased the Jeep toward their campsite, headlights off to keep our approach silent. Stopping a good distance away, we slipped out and quietly shut the doors. The path under our boots was damp from an earlier drizzle, which made our footfalls softer, but also gave the soil a perfect texture for stamping fake tracks. One by one, we planted oversized paw prints in the mud, making sure to press deeply near the tents. Every so often, we paused to listen, worried someone inside might stir and peek outside. But all we heard was the faint crackle of a dying fire. Next, Jim propped the lion pelt onto two sturdy sticks we duct-taped together. Seen straight on, it was eerily convincing. Massive head, snarling mouth, and the kind of glassy eyes that appeared to stare into your soul. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting an actual animal to emerge, drawn by the uncanny shape. With the pelt set up, we turned to the other part of our plan, the roars. We'd preloaded the PA system with a series of snarls and growls from real mountain lion recordings. Jim started them at a low volume from across the clearing. The first noise rumbled through the darkness like a threat, and I could almost sense the campers tensing in their tents. A second roar followed, echoing off the surrounding trees, making it sound as if multiple predators were encircling the area. I slipped back into the Jeep and carefully flicked on the headlights, aiming them so they backlit the pelt. From the angle of the beam, it looked like a living, breathing cat pacing along the outskirts of the camp. Jim shouted from behind a bush, "Stay in your tents!" His voice shook with just enough panic to convince anyone he was facing a genuine attack. "She's moving around us," he hollered, layering more drama into the moment. Then he bellowed, "There's another one." The reaction inside those tents was instant. Muffled cries, frantic rustling, the scrape of tent zippers being yanked shut. I killed the lights in one sudden click. Darkness swallowed the campsite. Jim dropped the sticks, and we ditched the lion pelt. In under a minute, we tore back to the Jeep, adrenaline hammering through every vein. As I started the engine and sped off, I thought I detected one final roar playing through the PA system, echoing behind us like a last warning. When dawn finally broke, the camp's radio chatter indicated that nobody had poked their head out until well into the morning. From our station windows, we could imagine their pale faces and wide eyes discovering the huge paw prints scattered around, some alarmingly close to their tent doors. We heard they packed up not long after, throwing nervous glances over their shoulders at the looming forest. No doubt, they were rattled to the core. Jim and I swapped glances, both relieved to hear they were safe, but also satisfied we'd given them something to think about. We'd wanted them to respect these woods, or at least remember that nature doesn't tolerate fools. From what we heard later, they told everyone about the mountain lion attack they'd barely survived. Maybe next time, they'd remember that out here. Silence can be the difference between a peaceful night and something far more dangerous. My name is Mara Caldwell, and I'm 28 years old. This happened along Paint Creek Scenic Trail in West Virginia during a trip I'd planned to reconnect with my art, and frankly, myself. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the noise of the world, but instead, it became something I still can't fully explain. I had just come off a long relationship that ended in the kind of breakup that leaves you questioning everything. Your choices, your direction, your worth. Art was the only thing that felt steady, so I packed up my RV and hit the road. Paint Creek had come up in my research as a serene, lesser-known spot for nature lovers. I thought it would be the perfect place to spend a few days sketching and painting in solitude. When I arrived, the place was exactly as described, quiet, secluded, and hauntingly beautiful. The creek meandered through dense woods, its surface catching the sunlight like shards of glass. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air carried a faint chill that hinted at the coming fall. I parked my RV near an old wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The bridge looked like it belonged in a ghost story, its weathered boards sagging slightly, but I couldn't resist its charm. I set up camp and spent the first day wandering the trails and sketching the landscape. The stillness was almost too perfect, but I chalked it up to being unused to this level of isolation. That night, I sat by the creek, working on a watercolor of the bridge as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest around me grew darker, and the silence became oppressive. There were no birds, no insects, just the sound of the water trickling over rocks. I tried to focus on my painting, but a strange unease crept over me. It was like the air had shifted, growing heavier, colder. And then I heard it, a faint humming. It was soft at first, almost melodic, but it didn't seem to have a source. It wasn't coming from the creek or the woods, it was just there. I froze, my brush hovering over the paper. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was a woman's voice, humming a tune I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. The humming stopped abruptly, as if I'd startled it. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. I told myself it must have been the wind or some trick of acoustics, packed up my supplies, and hurried back to the RV. The next morning, I woke to find my art supplies scattered across the ground outside the RV. My brushes were snapped in half, my paint spilled and smeared across the dirt. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into them, but there were no paw prints, no signs of disturbance other than the destruction itself. It didn't make sense. I spent the day trying to paint, but something felt off. The colors didn't look right. The lines felt shaky. Frustrated, I decided to take a break and explore more of the area. The old bridge drew me in again, its weathered planks creaking under my boots as I crossed it. The creek below was impossibly still, its surface like a mirror reflecting the gnarled trees overhead. On the far side of the bridge, I noticed something etched into one of the trees, a name and a date carved deep into the bark. Margaret, 1893. The letters were uneven, as if done in haste. But what caught my attention was the feeling that swept over me as I touched the carving, a sudden, overwhelming sadness that didn't feel like my own. That night, the humming returned. I was inside the RV, trying to sketch, when I heard it again, drifting through the stillness. It was louder this time, unmistakable. The sound seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The air was icy, much colder than it had been earlier, and the forest was eerily quiet. The humming led me to the bridge, where the fog had thickened, shrouding the creek in an otherworldly glow. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the creek, her back to me. She wore a long dress, the kind you'd see in old photographs, and her hair cascaded down her back in dark waves. She was humming that same mournful tune, the sound weaving through the air like a spell. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. She stopped humming, but didn't turn around. I took a hesitant step closer, and as I did, she began to dissolve, her form breaking apart like mist until there was nothing left but the fog. I stood there, frozen, unsure if what I'd seen was real or some trick of the light and my overactive imagination. The next day, I decided to drive into town to clear my head. At a small gas station, I struck up a conversation with the attendant, an older man who seemed to know the area well. "You're camping by the bridge, aren't you?" he asked when I mentioned Paint Creek. "Yeah, why?" He hesitated, then said, "People say it's haunted. They call her the Lady of Paint Creek. Story goes, she was abandoned by her husband during a harsh winter. He promised to come back for her, but he never did. She waited by that bridge until she froze to death. Now she haunts the creek, looking for people to join her." I laughed nervously, but his expression remained serious. "I'd avoid that bridge if I were you," he added, "especially at night." That evening, I couldn't stay away. Something about the Lady of Paint Creek drew me in, like a moth to a flame. I set up my easel near the bridge, determined to capture her essence in my painting. As the hours passed and the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog rolled in again, and the humming returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. The air around me grew colder, and when I looked up, there she was, standing in the middle of the bridge. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her hollow eyes bore into mine. She didn't move, but the humming turned into words, a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Stay with me." I backed away, but my foot slipped on the wet grass, and I fell. When I looked up, she was gone, but the feeling of her presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. I grabbed my supplies and ran back to the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, I dreamed of her. In the dream, I was standing on the bridge, staring down at the icy water. She appeared beside me, her hand cold as she touched my arm. "He left me," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "They all leave." When I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, just beyond the edges of my vision. I knew I had to do something to end this, to break her hold on me. On my final night at Paint Creek, I returned to the bridge with my sketchbook and paints. The fog was thicker than ever, and the cold seeped into my bones. I set up my supplies and began to paint, my hands trembling as I worked. I painted her story, the bridge, the creek, her lonely figure, waiting in the snow. As I finished, the humming surrounded me, and she appeared again. This time, closer. Her hollow eyes were filled with tears, and she reached out a hand toward the painting. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. "You're remembered now?" I said. my voice breaking. "You're not forgotten." She stared at the painting for what felt like an eternity, then dissolved into the mist. Her presence lifted, like a weight from my chest. The forest grew quiet again, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. I left Paint Creek the next morning, the painting tucked safely in the RV. It's one of my best works, but I've never been able to sell it. Something about it feels sacred, like it belongs to her. Even now, I hear her humming in my dreams, but it's softer now, almost peaceful, as if she's finally found rest. And maybe in a way, so have I. It wasn't my first job, and it sure as hell wasn't supposed to be my last, but something about that night didn't sit right from the beginning. Maybe it was the silence on the dispatch call, or the way the wind howled across the San Rafael desert, as if it knew something I didn't. I should have listened to that instinct, the one that makes your gut twist and your hands clench the steering wheel tighter than usual. But when the money's right, sometimes you take a job you wouldn't otherwise. The rig hummed beneath me as I barreled down I-70, heading west. The sky was bruised with the last light of day, purple streaks fading into a storm building on the horizon. I had a long way to go and no time to waste. They said the cargo was sensitive. He needed to be kept at exactly 20 degrees, and if I messed up, there'd be hell to pay. That wasn't what bothered me, though. What bothered me was not knowing what the hell I was hauling. When they don't tell you what's in the trailer, it's never good. My name's Roy Mallister. Bones to the few truckers who still know me on the road. 45 years old, and I've spent the last 20 behind the wheel. The road used to be a kind of escape for me, a way to outrun the things I didn't want to face. But that was before Carol passed, before I let everything else fall apart, including my relationship with my daughter Emily. Haven't talked to her in years, and I don't think about it much anymore. I'm good at avoiding things like that. But tonight, something felt different. The desert stretched out endlessly on either side of me, just red rock and dry air as far as the eye could see. I hadn't seen another car in miles, which was fine by me. The last thing I needed was distractions. That is, until the dashboard flashed red and the trailer's cooling unit flickered for the first time. I muttered a curse, pulling the rig over onto the shoulder. I cut the engine, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed out into the gathering dusk. The wind hit me hard, dust swirling around my boots as I made my way to the back of the trailer. I could hear the cooling unit working and stuttering like it was trying to fight off some kind of malfunction. Fumbling with the latch, I yanked open the back door and was greeted with a gust of frigid air. It smelled wrong in there, like cold metal and something decayed, the kind of smell that sticks in your nose and won't leave. I shined my light into the back, trying to figure out what was causing the problem. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping. No, not tapping. Scratching. It was coming from the crate, a large wooden crate strapped down in the center of the trailer, covered in heavy chains. My heart started to pound in my chest, the kind of adrenaline spike that tells you to get the hell out of there. But my feet wouldn't move. I inched closer, flashlight trembling in my grip. The scratching got louder. The crate shifted just slightly, as though something inside was alive. "What the hell?" I whispered, backing away. I wasn't going to open it. Not in a million years. I slammed the trailer door shut and locked it tight, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Whatever was in that crate, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I was just supposed to get it from point A to point B, no questions asked. I climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. Some government experiment or something. None of it mattered. All I had to do was deliver the damn thing. The radio crackled to life as I accelerated, and I jumped in my seat. Static. Then, through the fuzz, I heard something faint. A voice. A woman's voice. "Roy, why didn't you come back?" My heart stuttered. The voice sounded like Carol's. I smacked the side of the radio, trying to clear the signal, but the static only grew louder. The voice faded, replaced by an eerie, distorted country song, one I hadn't heard since she passed. It was one of her favorites. No, I muttered, turning the radio off. This was just stress getting to me. The isolation, the weird cargo, and the fact that I hadn't slept in 2 days. That's all it was. That's what I told myself as I sped down that endless stretch of highway. But the farther I drove, the worse it got. The storm hit an hour later, and with it came the figures. I thought they were just shadows at first, shapes in the mist thrown up by the desert sandstorm. But as the wind howled and the sand lashed against the windshield, I could swear I saw them. People walking along the roadside. No, not people. Ghosts. Old men in trucker caps, women in long, flowing dresses, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark as the night. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying not to look. If I didn't look, they weren't real. That's how it works, right? I blinked hard, forcing my eyes back on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was watching me, following me. The trailer lurched hard, like something had slammed into the back of it. "What the hell?" I shouted, swerving the rig as I fought for control. My headlights cut through the dust, illuminating the desolate highway, but there was nothing there. Nothing but empty miles. The trailer shook again, then came the knocking, loud, rhythmic, like someone was pounding on the inside of the crate. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was done pretending it was nothing. I was done lying to myself. I had to stop. I had to see what was in that crate. I pulled the rig to the side of the road again, hands trembling as I jumped out of the cab. The wind whipped sand into my face, stinging my eyes, but I didn't care. I grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox and made my way to the back of the trailer. The knocking hadn't stopped. It was louder now, more urgent. With a deep breath, I unlocked the trailer and threw the doors open. The cold hit me again, but this time it wasn't just the refrigeration. There was something wrong about it. The air inside was thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. I raised the crowbar, jammed it under the lid of the crate, and pried it open. And then everything stopped. The wind, the knocking, even the pounding of my own heart. Inside the crate, nestled in layers of straw and old cloth, was something small. It looked like a statue, a human skull, but blackened with strange symbols carved into the bone. It seemed to pulse, like it was alive, like it was breathing in time with me. And then the whispers started. Not from the radio this time, but from the skull itself. Voices swirling in my head, speaking in languages I couldn't understand. But one voice stood out, one voice I knew. Roy. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the skull began to glow with a faint, sickly light. The voices grew louder, and the wind picked up again, howling around the trailer. I slammed the crate shut and bolted the door. I didn't care what they said. I didn't care what I'd seen. I was getting the hell out of there. I threw the crowbar into the cab, jumped behind the wheel, and floored it. The trailer lurched behind me as I tore down the highway faster than I'd ever driven in my life. The storm whipped around me, and through the swirling dust, I could see them again. The figures. They were closer now, standing on either side of the road, their eyes following me. Some of them looked familiar. Faces I'd seen on the road before. Long-dead truckers, friends. Then, as if the storm itself parted, I saw her. Carol, standing in the middle of the road, her white dress flowing in the wind, her eyes locked on mine. I jerked the wheel, swerving to avoid her, but the rig skidded off the road. The trailer jackknifed as it skidded across the desert sand. I barely managed to hang on as the truck groaned to a stop, tilted sideways in a ditch. Silence. I sat there for a long time, staring out into the empty desert, trying to breathe. The storm passed, but I knew it wasn't over. I reached for my phone. No signal. No way out. And then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I saw her again. Carol walking slowly toward me. Her face pale and cold, her eyes filled with something I couldn't understand. "Roy," she whispered, her voice soft but clear in the stillness. "It's time to come home." I didn't run. I didn't scream. I just sat there, waiting as the darkness closed in around me. I didn't believe in ghosts, UFOs, or anything supernatural. I spent most of my career chasing down so-called paranormal phenomena and explaining them with cold, hard facts. That was my job, turning superstition into science, myths into measurable data. The Brown Mountain Lights? They were just another mystery waiting for a rational explanation. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV up the winding roads of Pisgah National Forest. The thick trees closed in on either side. The air was crisp, and autumn leaves scattered across the path. There was a quiet stillness that made the world feel far away. I should have felt calm, excited even. But as the sun began to sink behind the distant ridges, leaving the forest bathed in shadow, I felt something else. Tension. Shaking it off, I parked the RV at the remote campsite I'd scouted. This was supposed to be a solo trip, a few days to get up close and personal with the Brown Mountain Lights, interview locals, take readings, and prove once and for all that the lights were nothing more than atmospheric conditions or optical illusions. I had all the gear I'd need: high-resolution cameras, thermal scanners, EMF detectors, the works. I wasn't expecting to find anything supernatural, just an anomaly. And anomalies had explanations. But the moment I stepped out of the RV, a chill ran through me. The trees rustled softly, as if whispering some secret I wasn't meant to hear. Focus, I muttered to myself, dragging my gear out and setting up the cameras, angling them toward Brown Mountain Ridge. I had a perfect view of the ridge from my campsite, miles away, but clear in the distance. That's where the lights were supposed to appear. By the time I was fully settled in, I was sitting outside the RV, bundled in a jacket, sipping coffee, and staring out into the dark, waiting. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just stillness. Then, around midnight, I saw them. At first, they were faint, flickering, small orbs of light hovering just above the ridge. I squinted, adjusting the focus on my binoculars. There they were. Three lights bobbing in the air like they were floating on an invisible current. I grabbed my camera, flipping the switch to start recording, but nothing happened. The lens stayed black. The screen dead. What the hell? I muttered, fiddling with the buttons. Fully charged and brand new, the camera shouldn't have malfunctioned. I checked the battery, clicked it back into place, and tried again. Still nothing. Frustration surged through me. This was exactly what I'd come here for. The lights, right there in front of me, and I couldn't even capture them. I stood up, grabbing my thermal scanner, but when I flipped it on, the screen flickered, then went dark. "Come on," I whispered, trying to stay calm. The gear wasn't cheap, and none of it should have been failing, but it was, piece by piece. The lights danced on the ridge, growing brighter, closer. My heart raced. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I was just annoyed. The logical part of my brain struggled to make sense of it. Maybe the electronics were glitching because of interference. Some kind of electromagnetic field or something. I took a deep breath, trying to settle my nerves. But the lights, those strange pulsing orbs, kept moving, almost as if they were drifting toward me. The air turned cold, so cold that I could see my breath misting in front of my face. A thin layer of frost started forming on the ground, on the RV windows, on my gear. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my hands beginning to stiffen in the chill. It didn't make sense. The weather forecast had called for a cool night, but nothing like this. I checked my phone's temperature app. 30 degrees-y? Impossible. I glanced at my surroundings, feeling the silence close in around me. Then I noticed the lights were no longer on the ridge. They were much closer now, floating just above the treetops, flickering like distant fireflies, but larger. Too large. I watched, heart pounding, as they bobbed and weaved. Their glow cast long shadows on the ground. I pulled out my phone to take a video. The screen flashed, then went black. It wouldn't turn on. Frustration boiled over. I slammed the phone down on the camping table. It bounced. I stood there, fists clenched, trying to keep my cool. This was why people got sucked into believing nonsense, because technology failed at the worst possible moment. The lights weren't supernatural. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the cold was messing with the equipment, or some kind of atmospheric distortion. But then I saw the handprints. Small, faint handprints etched in frost on the RV window. They hadn't been there before. I knew that. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. They looked like the handprints of a child, no more than a few inches across. And they were slowly, gradually melting away in the cold. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I turned to look at the lights, now hovering at the edge of the forest. Close enough that I could make out their eerie bluish glow. They flickered in the trees, moving in slow, lazy circles, as if they were watching me, waiting for me. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible. There was no way the lights could have traveled that fast. No way they could be this close. I'd seen videos, read reports. They were always distant, spectral, unreachable. But now they felt personal, as if they were beckoning me. I swallowed, my throat tight. Without thinking, I took a step forward. The cold deepened, pressing in on me from all sides. The frost crept up the sides of the RV, spreading like delicate veins. The temperature continued to drop. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and my vision blurred. The lights drifted deeper into the trees, flickering and glowing, moving in a pattern that felt deliberate, like they wanted me to follow. And I did. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I made my way toward the forest's edge. The beam of light was weak, barely cutting through the dark. I kept my eyes on the lights, feeling a strange pull in my chest, like something was urging me forward. As I entered the trees, the world grew darker. The lights danced just out of reach, always a few steps ahead of me, their glow casting an ethereal light on the twisted branches. The forest felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed. I hadn't even noticed. My legs ached, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea how far I'd wandered. The lights flickered again, brightening as they circled a large boulder ahead, and then they stopped, hovering there, motionless. I took a step closer, and that's when the hallucinations began. Shapes, faint figures moving in the trees, shadows stretching unnaturally long. And there, between the branches, I saw faces. Pale, expressionless faces staring at me with hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. Panic set in. I turned to leave, but the forest had shifted. The path I'd taken was no longer clear. Everything looked the same trees, the same twisting branches. The lights pulsed behind me, glowing brighter as if taunting me. I ran. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. My heart raced in my chest as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find my way back to the campsite. The lights flickered at the corners of my vision, but I ignored them. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Light, quick footsteps crunching through the frost behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran faster, my flashlight flickering and dying in my hand. I broke through the tree line, gasping for air, and saw the RV ahead. A welcome sight. But the air around it was colder than ever. The frost was so thick on the windows that it looked like snow. And there, pressed against the glass, were more handprints, dozens of them. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me, and collapsed on the floor, panting. My entire body trembled with cold and fear. The lights were still out there. I could see them through the frosted windows, flickering in the trees, growing fainter as the night wore on. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By dawn, they were gone. The temperature returned to normal and the frost melted away, but I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I packed up the RV and drove out of Pisgah National Forest, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I'd come here to find an explanation, to debunk the Brown Mountain lights. But what I found was something else, something I couldn't explain. And I knew, deep down, that the lights weren't just a phenomenon. They were something more, something ancient, something dangerous, something that had almost taken me. I don't know what they wanted, but I'll never go back to find out. It had been 4 months since the divorce was finalized, and I was still trying to wrap my head around it. The life I had imagined, the woman I thought I would grow old with, it was all gone. That's why I decided to take the RV out to Mount Hood National Forest for a long weekend. I needed to get away from everything. No people, no reminders, just me and nature. My therapist said it would be good for me to clear my head and reconnect with something that didn't remind me of failure. Honestly, I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try something. If I stayed home, I would have just drowned myself in the silence of my empty apartment. This trip, I told myself, would be different. I could handle the quiet out here. I arrived in the late afternoon, pulling the RV into a spot near Timothy Lake. It was a beautiful area. Tall Douglas firs surrounded the lake like silent sentinels, the water reflecting the sky like a mirror. There were no other campers nearby, which was exactly what I wanted: solitude. I parked, shut off the engine, and took a deep breath. The air was cool, crisp, with that faint scent of pine needles. Perfect. For a moment, I thought I could finally breathe again. After setting up a small campfire, I sat back in my foldable chair, staring at the fading light over the mountains. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Peace. That's what I needed. But as the sun dipped lower, the quiet became overwhelming. There was no wind now, no rustling, no animal sounds. Just me, sitting in a bubble of silence. I checked my watch. It was just after 6 p.m. That's when I noticed it. It was too quiet. The forest around me, which should have been alive with the sounds of birds and insects, was dead silent. At first, I figured it was just a lull, but as the minutes dragged on, the silence pressed down on me like a weight. I could hear the blood pumping in my ears, the soft crunch of every movement I made in my chair. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. Maybe this was what true isolation felt like. No noise, no distractions, just me and my thoughts. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement between the trees. It was subtle, a shadow slipping between the trunks, just far enough away that I couldn't get a good look. I froze, squinting into the woods. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that played tricks on my mind. I scanned the tree line, waiting for the shadow to return, but saw nothing. The trees stood still, their branches unmoving in the dead air. "Must be a deer," I muttered, forcing myself to relax. The wind picked up briefly, rustling the leaves. I sighed, relieved to hear some kind of noise again. I grabbed a few more logs and threw them onto the fire. The crackling wood was comforting, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. I told myself I was just on edge from being out here, alone, with too much time to think. After eating a quick meal, I decided to call it an early night. The silence was getting under my skin, so I climbed into the RV, locked the door behind me, and settled into the small bed in the back. My phone had no signal, of course, but I wasn't planning on talking to anyone anyway. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to let my mind go blank, but the silence didn't let me rest. The RV was soundproofed, but even then I felt like something was missing. No crickets, no owls, nothing, just the absence of sound. I felt trapped inside my own head. Every little shift of the mattress or rustle of my blanket amplified in the quiet. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure why at first. There hadn't been any loud noises or nightmares, just silence. But something was wrong. My skin prickled with unease. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and glanced around the RV. The windows were fogged up, and the air felt heavier, somehow oppressive. I heard something outside. No, that wasn't right. I heard nothing outside. I swung my legs out of bed and stood, listening closely. It was the strangest sensation, like my own breathing was distant, muffled, as though I wasn't entirely in my own body. I moved toward the window and wiped away some of the condensation with my sleeve, peering into the blackness beyond the RV. For a long time, I saw nothing, just trees and shadows, and then movement. This time, I was sure. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the moonlight. Tall, unnaturally still, like it was waiting for something. My heart leapt into my throat as I strained to see more clearly. It didn't move, just stood there watching. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. I backed away from the window, heart pounding, my mind racing. Was it another camper? Some kind of ranger? No, there was no way anyone would be out here this late without a sound. I checked the door. It was still locked. Good. But I felt exposed, vulnerable, knowing that whatever was out there was watching me. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the window, sweeping the beam across the clearing. The figure was gone. Just like that. Vanished. As if it had never been there. The next morning, the forest was still eerily quiet. No birds, no animals, just the constant oppressive silence. I tried to shake off the unease from the night before, but it clung to me like a wet blanket. I told myself I was just paranoid, that the solitude was messing with my head, but something about the way the air felt today, something was off. I decided to take a short hike to clear my mind, hoping that getting out of the RV would make me feel better. But as I ventured down the trail, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something behind me, but the trail was empty. That's when I saw it again, a figure, this time in the distance, standing between the trees just off the trail. It was the same one from last night, tall, gaunt, and still. My heart hammered in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out more details. But before I could move, it slipped behind the trees and disappeared. I ran toward the spot where I'd seen it, my boots pounding against the damp earth. When I reached the trees, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to show that anyone had been there at all. I stood there, catching my breath, feeling the silence pressing down on me like a vice. That's when I noticed something strange. The forest around me was completely still. Even my footsteps had stopped making noise. I stopped my boot on the ground, but I heard nothing, not even the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. Panic surged through me. I clapped my hands together. Nothing. No sound. My breathing was shallow, frantic, but it was like I was listening to it from far away. The world had gone completely, impossibly silent. And then I saw them. Not just one figure, but several, moving between the trees. Their bodies blended with the shadows. They were everywhere, circling me in complete silence. My heart raced, but I couldn't hear it. I couldn't hear anything. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. My legs felt heavy, every step muted, like I was running underwater. The forest shifted around me, the trail disappearing into the thick fog that had rolled in, disorienting me further. Somehow I made it back to the RV. I slammed the door shut, locking it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but still no sound. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call for help, but it was useless. The screen flickered, the GPS spinning in circles. I was trapped. For the next few hours, I stayed inside the RV, pacing back and forth, trying to calm myself down, but the silence never lifted. I couldn't even hear my own thoughts anymore. Just the crushing weight of nothingness. And then, as the light began to fade, I saw them again, the silent ones. They were standing in a circle around the RV, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. There were no features, no mouths, just smooth skin where their faces should have been. They stood perfectly still, watching me through the windows, their bodies unnervingly thin and elongated. I banged on the window, screaming, but of course, no sound came. They didn't flinch, didn't move. They just stared, waiting. Desperation clawed at me. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. Every time I tried, the engine sputtered and died, as if something was draining the life out of it. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, stepping outside. The silent ones didn't move, didn't react. But as I walked toward them, the air grew colder, the silence even more oppressive. My footsteps made no sound. My breathing was barely there. I felt a hand on my shoulder and spun around, expecting to see one of them behind me. But there was nothing, just the fog swirling around me and the figures waiting in the distance. In that moment, I realized what they wanted. They weren't going to kill me. No, that would be too simple. They wanted me to join them, to become one of them. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a part of them, and it was seeping into me, stealing my voice, my thoughts, my very sense of self. And if I stayed here much longer, I knew I would lose everything. I don't remember how I made it out. The next thing I knew, I was driving far away from the campsite, from the silent ones. The sound of the engine, the tires on the road, it was all faint, like I was still caught in their grip. But at least there was something, a reminder that I hadn't completely disappeared into that silence. It's been weeks since I got back, but I can still feel it. The quiet follows me, lingers in the corners of my apartment. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I can feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. And I know that one day, they'll come for me again. This time, I won't be able to run. My name is Jacob Johnson, and this happened back in 1996 out near the ragged coastline of Maine. I had this idea of finding some peace, so I borrowed my uncle's RV for the summer, thinking I'd get some fresh air, recharge from life. I figured I'd get in some solo time, a few fishing trips, some quiet nights. That's how I ended up at a park near Black Harbor, a little nowhere town that didn't even get cell reception back then. This wasn't a famous national park or even one of those scenic overlooks that people make pilgrimages to. It was just woods, rough and thick, fading into a rocky coastline that nobody seemed to care about. I was a few days into my quiet escape, living off canned beans on a half-empty propane stove that hissed with a little too much attitude for my taste. The most exciting part of my day was waiting for the rain to pass so I could take out my fishing rod. I didn't expect much more than sea salt air and seagulls. It was halfway through my fourth day, sometime in the late afternoon, that I heard what I figured must be kids from the local town messing around. The voices were faint, echoing through the woods in some distant way that made it hard to place them. I thought about walking down to see what was going on, maybe throwing a rock or two to scare them off if they got too close, but I didn't think much of it. By evening, though, something had shifted. I heard footsteps, not the quick, careless crunch of sneakers, but deliberate, slow steps. I was in the RV, scratching down a grocery list of things I'd need on my next trip back to town when I caught the sound. It was steady, creeping up around the corner of the RV. It hit me that I hadn't seen another soul out here since I'd arrived, and that didn't sit right. I mean, who comes out to this kind of place aside from someone with a taste for quiet or trouble? I kept still, waiting for the person to pass or show themselves, but there was only the slow, shuffling drag of footsteps. I tried to listen for the sound of multiple feet or voices, but it was dead silent except for that single shuffle. Against my better judgment, I opened the RV door and stepped outside. Nothing, just trees swaying in the evening light. But my instinct told me to keep quiet. I could still feel something out there, hiding. The kind of presence that prickles the hair on your neck and makes you regret stepping out of safety. I stayed there, scanning the tree line, listening. I almost thought I'd imagined it until I spotted something strange, half hidden between the trees, a figure, still as stone, facing away from me. The guy looked like he was part of the forest itself, cloaked in grime, with torn, mud-stained clothes hanging off him like a loose second skin. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. Just stood there, as if rooted to the ground. Now, I don't scare easy, but something about this man felt like a bad omen. I cleared my throat, thinking maybe he was some lost hiker or drifter, but he didn't flinch, didn't even look at me. Finally, I called out something casual, like asking if he needed directions. Still nothing. After a long moment, he turned, slow, like he was trying to remember how to move. His face was something I'll never forget, but not because it was scary exactly. It was hollow, if that makes any sense. This blank expression, like he'd forgotten what it meant to be human. He took a step forward, just one, like he was testing the ground. I backed up so fast I almost tripped. I tried to laugh it off, told myself he was just some messed up camper, but the way he looked at me, it was like he wasn't looking at me at all, just through me. I ducked back into the RV, my heart racing, and locked the door. It felt stupid, locking up, but something about him felt off, like he wasn't just some regular guy lost in the woods. I figured he'd wander off, but minutes later, I heard him shuffling again, this time closer to the RV. I looked out the window and saw him standing right there, not more than 10 feet away. His face twisted into this deadpan stare that sent a chill down my spine. Then came the whispering. Low, muttering sounds, barely audible, like he was talking to someone only he could hear. At first, I thought he was addressing me, but then I realized he wasn't looking at the RV at all. His head tilted, and he mumbled something about payment and lost souls. The words were scattered, fragmented, like someone trying to piece together a broken sentence. I sat there watching him, my heart pounding so loud I thought he'd hear it, but he just kept muttering, almost in a trance. At that point, I was just about ready to pack it up and find somewhere else to park. I reached for my bag, ready to throw some stuff together, when the RV suddenly rocked. I heard metal groaning, and something slammed into the side with a force that shook the whole rig. I was paralyzed for a second, gripping the edge of the table as the guy outside went silent. All I could hear was his breathing, loud and ragged against the thin walls of the RV. I heard a scratching sound, nails or something, scraping along the side, followed by a soft thud, as if he was testing the edges, feeling out the RV like it was some sort of animal he was trying to corner. I kept still, my back pressed against the wall, listening to every sound. I'd never felt fear like that. This primal kind of terror that kicks in when you realize you're trapped. The scratching stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps receding. I took a breath, thinking maybe he'd finally left, but then I smelled something foul. It was a metallic, rotten scent that crept through the vents, filling the air inside with a stench so bad it turned my stomach. I gagged, covering my nose, and nearly bolted for the door. Before I could, I heard him speak again. His voice was low and guttural this time. He muttered louder, "Must be paid." I froze, not sure if he was talking to himself or if he was giving some kind of twisted warning. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I grabbed my bag and edged toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. I took a quick look through the window and saw him walking away, his figure disappearing into the trees. I bolted, taking off through the woods in the opposite direction. The sound of his footsteps echoed somewhere behind me, and for a moment, I thought I could hear him muttering again. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I'd cleared the tree line and hit the gravel road. My feet ached, and my lungs burned, but I didn't care. I just kept running, putting as much distance as I could between me and that place. Hours later, I found a small gas station by the highway and told the cashier everything. He gave me this look, like he'd heard it before, then mumbled something about an old man who'd gone crazy years ago, back when the town was still booming. He said the guy used to wander the woods, talking to himself about debts and payments, claiming to be some sort of collector. Local legend had it that he went mad after his family drowned in a storm. The story was that he'd gone feral, taking to the woods, driven by some twisted sense of revenge or justice. I don't know if I believe in all that. All I know is that I saw him, heard him, and every time I think of that muttering, "Debt must be paid," I feel a chill that doesn't fade. I don't know who he thought I was or what debt he imagined I owed, but I'll tell you one thing. I'm never setting foot near Black Harbor again. Some debts you just don't pay. When I left the city, I was desperate for peace. After a messy divorce and years spent staring at screens, I wanted silence. Real silence. Not the muffled hum of traffic or the constant buzz of electronics, but the quiet only nature could offer. That's how I ended up in Mohan State Park, alone in my old RV, parked on the edge of the Clear Fork Gorge. The park was stunning, especially in the late afternoon light. Trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their leaves a tapestry of green and gold. The air smelled clean, untouched by asphalt or fumes. It was perfect, at least at first. The first day was uneventful. I hiked the main trails, snapping a few photos with my phone, and spent the evening cooking a simple meal on my RV's small stove. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a rare kind of contentment. This was what I needed. No emails, no ex-wife, no one telling me what to do or who to be. Just me in the woods. But by the second day, things began to feel off. It started when I noticed the trail. I had been walking back to my RV after a long hike when I spotted it. A faint path branching off the main one, almost hidden by overgrown bushes. It was narrow, barely more than a line of packed dirt, and it twisted sharply into the woods. Something about it tugged at me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just tired of the predictability of the main trails. Whatever it was, I stepped off the beaten path and onto the faint trail. The air felt different as I walked, heavier, quieter. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, seemed muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. After a few minutes, I found the ruins. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I saw the remains of a chimney and the rotting beams of what must have been a small cabin. A rusted metal lantern sat in the dirt, its handle broken. The ground was littered with shards of pottery and what looked like animal bones. A shiver crawled up my spine. Someone lived out here, I muttered to myself. The idea seemed impossible. This part of the park was miles from any road, and the trail was nearly invisible. Why would anyone build a cabin here? I snapped a photo and turned back toward the RV, eager to put the strange scene behind me. That night, the noises started. I had just crawled into bed when I heard it, a faint snapping sound, like someone stepping on a twig. I froze, my heart pounding. Raccoons, I told myself. Or maybe deer. I wasn't exactly deep in the wilderness, so wildlife was normal. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to an animal. They circled the RV, crunching the dry leaves and stopping occasionally, as if whoever or whatever was out there was listening. I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door, shining the beam into the trees. "Hello?" I called, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Is someone out there?" The forest stared back at me, silent and empty. After a few minutes, I retreated inside, locking the door and double-checking the windows. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and I convinced myself it was just a hiker passing through. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, I stopped by the visitor center to report the strange noises. Leah, the park guide on duty, greeted me with a friendly smile, but it faltered when I described what I'd heard. "You were near the old trapper's cabin, weren't you?" she asked, her voice low. I blinked. "Trapper's cabin?" she nodded. "It's an old story. Back in the early 1900s, a man built a cabin deep in the woods, far from anyone else. They say he was reclusive, didn't trust people. One day, he just vanished. No one knows what happened, but some locals think his ghost still wanders the forest." I couldn't help but laugh. "Ghosts? Come on." Leah shrugged. "Believe what you want, but I'd stay away from that area if I were you. People say the forest gets strange near the cabin." I left the visitor center feeling annoyed. Ghost stories were fine for campfire entertainment, but I wasn't about to let a local legend ruin my weekend. That night, the disturbances grew worse. I was halfway through dinner when the lights in the RV flickered and went out. I swore under my breath, grabbing a flashlight to check the breaker. As I fumbled with the panel, I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time, circling the RV like a predator sizing up its prey. The flashlight beam caught something on the ground. Footprints. Human footprints. Large and deep, as if whoever made them was heavy. My breath caught in my throat. "Okay," I muttered, trying to steady myself. "Someone's messing with me." Grabbing my hiking boots, I stepped outside, determined to confront whoever was out there. But the second I stepped into the clearing, the forest fell silent. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that pressed against my ears. That's when I saw the first figure. It was pale and thin, barely more than a shadow against the trees. It stood perfectly still, its face obscured by darkness. Then it moved, not toward me, but away, disappearing into the woods without a sound. I didn't follow. Instead, I locked myself in the RV, sat by the window gripping a kitchen knife, and watched the forest until dawn. By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind. I had to go back to the cabin. I needed answers. The trail felt even more oppressive in the daylight. The air was thick, and the silence was absolute. When I reached the clearing, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A small, rusted knife lying in the dirt. Next to it was a notebook, its cover warped with age. I picked it up carefully, flipping through the yellowed pages. Most of the writing was illegible, but a few sentences stood out, scrawled in jagged letters. "It watches from the trees. Don't disturb the woods. The forest is alive." A chill ran down my spine. As I turned to leave, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, the dirt rippling like water. The trees creaked, their branches twisting unnaturally. And then I felt it. A presence. Something unseen, massive, and ancient. Watching me from every direction. I ran. The RV was my only sanctuary, but even there I wasn't safe. The lights flickered. The floor trembled. The air grew thick with the stench of damp earth. Through the window, I saw the pale figure again, joined by others, shadows slipping between the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The ground beneath the RV began to groan, roots writhing like snakes. I turned the key in the ignition, praying the engine would start. It roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas. As the RV lurched forward, the figures began to move, their blank faces turning toward me. The roots clawed at the tires, but the momentum was enough to break free. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest shrinking in my rearview mirror. I never went back to Mohan State Park. Whatever was in those woods, it didn't want me there. And I was more than happy to stay away. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the forest. I hear footsteps outside my window, and I swear I can feel its eyes on me. The forest doesn't forget, and neither do I. My name is Noah Brown, and I'm 36 years old. This happened last fall when I decided to take my first solo RV trip to Spruce Knob Lake in West Virginia. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to escape the wreckage of my divorce and prove to myself that I could handle life on my own. I was tired of feeling like a failure, and this trip was my attempt at reclaiming some confidence. Looking back, I realize how naive I was. The forest doesn't care about your pride. I pulled into the campground late in the afternoon. The drive had been longer than expected, thanks to winding mountain roads and a temperamental GPS that insisted I make turns onto non-existent paths. Spruce Knob Lake lay in a valley, surrounded by dense forest, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. Before heading to the lake, I stopped at a small gas station on the edge of town to fill up and grab a few snacks. The attendant was an old woman with gray hair pinned in a tight bun. Her eyes had the kind of intensity that made you feel exposed. "Heading to Spruce Knob, huh?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "A couple of days by the lake should be peaceful." Her expression darkened. "Don't go wandering the woods after dark, and if you see a lantern, you turn the other way." "A lantern?" I chuckled nervously, hoping to break the tension. "I'll keep that in mind." But as I drove away, her words lingered in my mind. By the time I reached the campground, the sun was dipping below the tree line. I parked the RV near the edge of the lake and set up a basic campsite. My gear was minimal: a rented stove, a secondhand flashlight, and a cheap folding chair that creaked every time I shifted my weight. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. The rustle of leaves, the soft lap of water against the shore, the occasional groan of the wind through the trees. Around 9 p.m., as I was reading by the dim glow of my lantern, I noticed something strange. A flickering light in the woods across the lake. It wasn't the steady beam of a flashlight or the glow of a campfire. It moved erratically, like an old oil lantern swaying in someone's hand. At first, I thought it might be another camper. But the more I watched, the more unsettling it became. The light moved deeper into the trees, then stopped, then blinked out. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But that night, as I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning, I decided to explore one of the trails that looped around the lake. The air was crisp, the leaves a vibrant mix of red and gold, and for a while, I felt like I'd made the right choice coming here. About an hour into my hike, I heard it. Soft, rhythmic giggling. A child's laughter coming from somewhere ahead. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. No response. As I rounded a bend, I saw her, a little girl sitting on a rock by the trail. She looked about 10 years old, with dark hair and a pale face. She was wearing old-fashioned clothes, a long skirt and a cardigan that seemed out of place. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on something in the distance. "Are you lost?" I tried again. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at me out of the corner of her eye. Then she stood and walked into the forest without a word. "Wait," I called, hurrying after her. But when I reached the spot where she disappeared, there was no sign of her. Just a muddy child's shoe sitting on the ground. By the time I got back to the RV, the clouds had rolled in, turning the afternoon gray and heavy. I tried to push the encounter with the girl out of my mind, telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. Maybe she was a local kid playing in the woods. That night, things got worse. The electrical system in the RV started acting up. The lights flickered erratically, and the radio turned on by itself, blasting static. My flashlight died, even though I had just put in fresh batteries. I lit my lantern for some semblance of control, but the flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the RV feel smaller, more claustrophobic. Then came the sound of footsteps. They circled the RV, slow and deliberate. I peered out the window but saw nothing. Still, the sound continued, crunching leaves and snapping twigs just outside. I locked the door and sat on the bed, gripping a kitchen knife I'd brought for cooking. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the silence was almost worse. Then a voice broke the stillness. "Stephen," it said, a child's voice. Against every instinct, I opened the door. The forest beyond was shrouded in darkness, but there it was again, the flickering light. The lantern hovered at the edge of the woods, swaying gently as if beckoning me closer. And then I saw her, the little girl, standing beneath the light. "Help me," she whispered, her voice carrying through the still air. I stepped out of the RV. My legs moved almost against my will. The lantern retreated into the forest, and I followed. The girl's figure was always just out of reach. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous, the ground soft and uneven beneath my boots. The lantern led me to the edge of a ravine, its rocky walls plunging into darkness. At the bottom, I saw something glinting, a small mirror, cracked and streaked with dirt. The little girl stood beside it, her pale face illuminated by the lantern's eerie glow. "Jump," she said softly. "What?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "You have to jump," she repeated. Her voice wasn't pleading anymore. It was cold, commanding. I looked down at the ravine, at the jagged rocks below. The lantern hovered above the abyss, flickering like it was waiting for me to obey. Something in me snapped. "No," I said, my voice firm. The girl's face twisted into something monstrous. Her eyes darkened, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You don't get to choose," she hissed, her voice no longer human. I reached into my bag and pulled out my journal, the one thing I'd brought to document my journey to rediscover myself. Without hesitation, I hurled it into the ravine. The lantern flared violently, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. The girl screamed, a sound that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night, and then she and the lantern vanished. I stumbled back to the RV, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The electrical system was working again, the lights steady, the radio silent. I packed up and left before the sun rose, driving until I was miles away from Spruce Knob Lake. A week later, I found something waiting for me in my apartment. Sitting on the kitchen counter was an old oil lantern, its glass cracked and filled with ash. When I picked it up, I heard it, soft, rhythmic giggling, echoing from somewhere deep inside. I haven't camped since. The wilderness isn't always what it seems. Sometimes it's better to stay lost in the chaos of the city than risk finding what waits in the silence of the woods. My name is James Stevens, and this happened to me back in 2002 while camping in Mount Rainier National Park. I'd borrowed my cousin's RV for the first time. He said I was due for some real scenery therapy, as he called it. Away from the stress and noise of the city. I had just wrapped up a divorce, and my mind was cluttered. Nature felt like a good reset button. I set up at Cougar Rock Campground, a secluded part of the park with tall pines and a stream that burbled quietly just out of sight. Peaceful, until the silence starts creeping up on you. The kind of silence that makes every sound, like a twig snapping or water trickling, seem 10 times louder. I parked the RV near the forest's edge, half a mile from the nearest camper, figuring the solitude would be good for me. Less human interaction, more time staring at clouds and mountains. Around mid-afternoon, I met another camper. His name was Russell, an older guy with a scraggly beard and a perpetual frown. He told me he'd been camping there for years, always alone. He said he liked the solitude, the natural rhythm of the place. whatever that meant. He had this rough way of talking, every word thick like he was chewing on gravel. Friendly enough, though, and I thought it was kind of nice to have a fellow loner around. We talked a bit about the area, and then he mentioned something about strange folks drifting into the park lately. People who didn't seem to belong, as he put it. I shrugged it off, but I did notice that Russell's campsite was a mess, with empty cans and old camping gear scattered around like he'd set up for the long haul. I got this off feeling, like he wasn't there just for the peace and quiet, but I brushed it off. He was just another stranger in the woods. No more, no less. By sundown, I was back at my RV, thinking a quick dinner of instant noodles would do just fine. I cranked up the little camping stove, ate in silence, then decided to go for a short walk by the water, flashlight in hand. The stream was a faint line of silver under the moonlight, but everything else had fallen into darkness. I'd taken just a few steps when I saw someone else on the trail. Not Russell. This guy was tall, with wild hair, clothes that were patched and frayed, and a scar that ran from his left cheek down to his neck. I gave him a nod, the casual, keep your distance nod people give in the wilderness. He didn't respond, just stared back, his eyes lingering a bit too long. I kept walking, but I could feel his gaze following me. It was like the guy was sizing me up. Back at my RV, I locked the door and made sure the windows were secure. I had just settled in to get some sleep when I heard footsteps. Light ones at first, like someone trying not to be heard. I thought maybe it was Russell. Maybe he'd had a bit too much of whatever he was drinking by the fire earlier. So I ignored it. But then the footsteps grew louder, then stopped, right by the side of the RV. A minute later, there was a light knock on the door. I froze, listening, my mind racing through who it could be. No one else was around. Not this late. I ignored it, hoping whoever it was would take the hint. But then came another knock, louder this time. I crept up to the small window by the door and peered out, just enough to catch a glimpse. It was the scarred man from earlier. He was standing there, his head tilted, a sick smile stretching his mouth like he'd found exactly what he was looking for. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to keep calm. I hadn't brought a gun, something I was seriously regretting at this point. But the guy hadn't seen me yet. Maybe he'd just leave if I stayed quiet. Then, in a voice just loud enough to cut through the walls, he said, "Hey, Brandon, I know you're in there." The blood drained from my face. How the hell did he know my name? I didn't remember mentioning it to anyone except Russell, and even then, it was in passing. My mind scrambled through every option. Stay silent? Open the door and try to talk him down? Grab something heavy and defend myself? I reached for a frying pan, the heaviest thing within arm's reach. Not exactly a weapon, but better than nothing. I crept toward the door, thinking maybe I could give him a hard enough swing to make him rethink his plans. But just as I was about to take a breath and steady myself, the guy pounded on the door. Hard. Enough force to shake the whole RV. "Brandon, open up. I'm not leaving until we talk," he said. His tone was calm, like he was asking for a cup of sugar instead of trying to break into my camper. Then I heard it. A scraping sound, like metal against metal. I looked down and saw a thin blade, maybe a pocket knife, slowly working its way through the RV door lock. A wave of panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I pushed against the door as hard as I could, holding it in place with my weight. The blade slipped, and I heard him curse under his breath. For a second, I thought maybe I'd scared him off. But then, the guy's face appeared in the window, eyeing me with a mix of annoyance and amusement. "You don't make this easy, do you?" he muttered. I must have looked terrified because he laughed, low and hollow. He tapped the window, pointing at me like I was a bug in a jar. That's when I caught the movement behind him, a dark figure moving out of the tree line, slowly, deliberately. Russell, he must have heard the noise and come over to check things out. Russell didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching. For a second, I thought he was going to help me, that he'd scare this guy off, but he didn't. He just watched, his face expressionless, as the guy kept trying to force his way in. I pounded on the window, yelling for Russell to help, to do something, but he stood there, unmoved. And then I realized Russell was in on it. Suddenly, I was a trapped animal. The frying pan felt absurd in my hands, 2 against 1, and I was stuck inside a fiberglass cage. There was no way I'd make it if they got in. My only shot was to run. I dropped the pan, shoved open the emergency hatch in the roof, and scrambled up. The cold air bit against my face. I heard them both cursing below as I climbed, stumbling over myself in the darkness. I was barefoot, the sharp gravel digging into my feet as I ran for the tree line, my heart hammering like a drum. The RV was small, but in that moment, it felt like an ocean between me and those two maniacs. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept running. Eventually, I reached the ranger station, my feet bloody, my body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. They found Russell and his friend later that night, hiding out near the campsite with a whole stash of stolen camping gear and weapons. Turns out they'd been robbing campers for months, using the park's seclusion to get away with it. In the end, Russell claimed he'd just been there by coincidence when the scarred guy attacked me. But the scarred man wasn't so lucky. After a short scuffle with the cops, he was arrested, with enough evidence of his outdoor exploits to keep him locked up for life. It turned out he had a habit of finding interesting campers to mess with, using the solitude of the park as his own twisted playground. That's what went down that night at Mount Rainier. And I still don't know what Russell's deal was, whether he was in on it from the start or just a bystander too afraid to stand up. But one thing's for sure, I'll never be borrowing an RV for scenery therapy again. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as if the forest were holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I'd heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps. One locals swore disappeared and reappeared as if it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it, film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera, set it up, and filmed a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore are fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground, its surface covered in spiraling symbols that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving. The trees closed in tighter, and the trail became fainter, more overgrown. Soon, it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping the camera rolling. But after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment, there had been a clear path. Now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed I was in the middle of nowhere. No path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me. Alone. In the fog. Okay, I muttered. You've dealt with worse. I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. I froze. The sound came from deeper in the forest. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then, out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. "Hey," I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. "You lost too?" The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. "I've been walking for days," he said, his voice hoarse. "The trail, it keeps changing." "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. "No one's okay out here." I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "The trail, it moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path, it's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave." I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. "Look, I have a GPS," I said, pulling it out. "We can find our way back." The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. "It won't help. The forest is messing with it." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get this guy some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago would be choked with brambles. When I looked back, trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees, thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. "Nate," I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked Eli. He nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us." "The forest." I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree, high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside, water, food, like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around like he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The whispers grew louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen. Shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I'd witnessed, the proof of the vanishing trail and the strange, shifting forest. But the videos showed nothing. The trail looked normal. The mist wasn't as thick, and Eli wasn't in the footage at all. It was like he'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it had been a bad trip, that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had let me leave, but it hadn't forgotten me. And I had a feeling it was waiting somewhere in the mist for me to return. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, immersed in the silence for hours, but now something felt off. The kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life. Birds, insects, something. But the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV, where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique I'd brought along to mess around with in my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing. Until now. I stood up from the fire, walked over to the RV, and ducked inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it. A voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers, 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment, then the numbers started again. 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere. Maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing. I was sure of it. But the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong. Like the message wasn't for just anyone. It was for me. I shut the radio off. My fingers were trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods. The towering pines loomed overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1, 3, 7, 8. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, I shook it off and stepped back outside, trying to push the growing unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weathered jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. "I heard it too," he said. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Heard what?" "The signal, the numbers," he said, glancing toward the RV. "I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal." My mouth went dry. "You've heard it too?" The man nodded. "I'm Ben," he said, stepping closer, his voice low. "I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static, voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working. My cell phone drained to 0 in minutes." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "What do you think it is?" Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. "I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer." I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals. Glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes, that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 1, 3, 7, 8. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes constantly scanned the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. "You think it's some kind of broadcast?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. "I don't think it's a broadcast at all." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I think it's a warning, or a signal from something out there." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning from what? Before I could ask, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest. And then, through the radio, a voice crackled to life. "We see you." My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical, "We see you." I stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, coming from all around us, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. "I think we should leave," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once, I agreed. The next morning, I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no note. Just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles. The battery drained faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 1, 3, 7. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected. An old, dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal. A small glowing device pulsing with an eerie cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, it all crashed into me at once. An unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, like something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV, but the lights followed me, the clicking never far behind. But I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper, even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. It's been days now, and I'm still hearing them. 1, 3, 7. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am. And it's not done with me yet.
My name is Stephen Miller. I'm 51 years old, a retired high school teacher and a widower. What I'm about to tell you happened just last month during a solo camping trip off Old King Road in Flagler County, Florida. I thought I was looking for peace and quiet, maybe even a little closure. Instead, I found something I still can't explain, something that might still be out there waiting. I arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. The drive down Old King Road was scenic but desolate, with tall oaks draped in Spanish moss and palmettos crowding the edges of the narrow dirt road. My RV, a beaten-up 1994 Winnebago, rattled over every bump, but I was used to it. This wasn't my first trip, but something about the stillness unsettled me. I stopped at a convenience store a few miles before the campsite to grab some firewood and snacks. The woman behind the counter, Maggie, looked up from a magazine as I approached. "Camping out on King Road?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "Yeah," I said. "I heard it's quiet out there. Good stargazing." She hesitated. "It's quiet, all right. Just don't wander too far from your RV, and if you hear anything strange, don't go looking for it." I laughed it off, but her words stayed with me as I drove the final stretch to the campsite. The sun was low, and I parked near a pond. The water was dark and still, the air smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. I liked the solitude, at least that's what I told myself. The first sign that something wasn't right came that night. I had a small fire going, and the RV's generator was humming softly. I was sitting by the fire nursing a cup of instant coffee when the generator sputtered and died. The sudden silence was jarring. "Damn thing," I muttered, grabbing a flashlight to check it out. Everything looked fine. No loose wires, no obvious problems. When I flipped the switch, it roared back to life as if nothing had happened. I returned to my chair, but the unease lingered. The forest around me felt too quiet, like the wildlife had been holding its breath. Then I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes behind me. I turned, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Probably a raccoon, I thought, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. The pond looked serene in the daylight, its surface reflecting the grey sky. As I circled it, I noticed something strange, footprints in the mud. They were large, clawed, and definitely not human. A chill ran down my spine. That's when I saw him, a teenage boy, maybe 15 or 16, standing at the edge of the trees. He was thin, with dirty clothes and wild, unkempt hair. His eyes darted nervously as if he didn't want to be seen. "Hey there," I called out. "Are you lost?" The boy flinched, but he didn't run. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. "Do you live out here?" He shook his head. "It's watching you. It watches everyone. You have to leave before it gets dark." Before I could ask more, he turned and bolted into the woods. I considered going after him, but something in his voice, pure, raw fear, stopped me. I returned to the RV, uneasy. That evening, I found a mutilated deer near the edge of the pond. Its body was torn apart, the flesh twisted and shredded as if by massive claws. I've seen animal attacks before, but this was different. It looked deliberate. I decided to stay inside the RV that night. The generator kept cutting out, leaving me in darkness for minutes at a time. Each time the lights flickered back on, I thought I saw movement outside the windows, shadows darting just out of sight. Around midnight, I heard a sound that froze me in place. My late wife's voice. "Stephen," Dana whispered, "come outside." I knew it wasn't real. I'd been dreaming of Dana ever since she passed, but this was different. Her voice was so clear, so close. When it called again, I almost opened the door before catching myself. "No," I whispered, backing away. "You're not real." The whispers stopped, but the RV shuddered violently as if something heavy had slammed into it. I grabbed a kitchen knife and held it tight, my heart racing. The shuddering stopped, leaving me in silence. The next morning I found deep scratches on the RV's door, like claw marks. The boy, Ethan, appeared again, standing at a distance. His eyes were wide, his face pale. "It's hungry," he said. "It doesn't stop." "What is it?" I demanded, approaching him. "What's out there?" He hesitated, then muttered, "It's old. It was here before us. It feeds on fear, on grief. If you don't leave, it'll take you." I tried to get him to explain, but he ran off again. This time I followed him. He led me deeper into the woods, where the trees grew denser and the air colder. Finally, we reached a clearing with strange symbols carved into the trunks. Ethan pointed at them. "This keeps it out," he said. "Stay here if you want to live." Before I could ask more, he vanished into the trees. I looked around, my pulse hammering. The forest felt alive, the air thick with an oppressive energy. The whispers started again, louder this time, coming from all directions. I returned to the RV, but the hunger followed. That night, it showed itself. I was sitting by the fire when the forest went silent. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure at the edge of the trees. It was humanoid, but wrong, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes glowed yellow, fixed on me. "Dana," it said, its voice distorted and hollow. "Come to me." I stood frozen as it stepped closer. The firelight flickered, and I saw its face, or what was left of it. The flesh was stretched and rotting, its mouth too wide, filled with jagged teeth. I grabbed a can of lighter fluid and dashed it onto the fire pit, igniting a massive flame. The creature recoiled, letting out an unearthly shriek. I ran toward the symbols Ethan had shown me, the hunger chasing me through the trees. The moment I crossed the boundary of the symbols, the hunger stopped. It paced back and forth, hissing and snarling, but unable to cross. I stayed there until dawn, clutching the knife and listening to its guttural growls. When the sun rose, the hunger vanished. I returned to the RV, packed up, and drove away without looking back. I stopped at Maggie's store on the way out. She took one look at me and nodded. "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded, too shaken to speak. "You're lucky," she said. "Most people don't make it out." Later I tried to find information about Ethan, but no one had seen a boy matching his description in years. Some said he was a ghost, a victim of the hunger long ago. Others claimed he was something else entirely, a guardian of sorts, protecting the living from the forest's darkness. Whatever the truth, I know one thing for certain. The hunger is real, and it's still out there, waiting. My name is Kenneth Warren. I'm 42 years old, and this happened a few months ago when I decided to take a break from the life I'd been barely holding together. My wife, Jenna, passed away last year, and the silence of my empty home had become unbearable. I'd always loved music. It's what I taught for years. But after she died, I couldn't bring myself to pick up a guitar. So I bought an RV and decided to travel, hoping to find something, anything, that would help me feel alive again. That's how I ended up at Big Shays State Park in Florida. I'd read about the park's rapids, the largest in the state, and thought their roaring, chaotic beauty might inspire me to compose again. What I didn't know was that the silence I'd been running from would find me there, in the voices of the dead. I pulled into the park just before dusk. The forest was dense and quiet, save for the distant roar of the rapids. The ranger station was empty, but I found a map pinned to the bulletin board outside. It marked a few trails and campsites, one of which was near the riverbank. That's where I decided to stay. As I set up my RV, a ranger approached, a woman in her 30s wearing the usual khaki uniform and a wide-brimmed hat. Her name tag read Laura. "Camping alone?" she asked, her tone polite but laced with concern. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just needed some peace and quiet." Laura nodded but hesitated. "The rapids can be unpredictable. Be careful if you hike near the water." She paused, glancing toward the tree line. "Some people say you can hear voices out there at night. Probably just the water playing tricks, but it can be unsettling if you're not used to it." I smiled, more amused than unnerved. Thanks for the warning. Laura didn't return the smile. Just don't wander too far. With that, she left, her words hanging in the cool evening air. After dinner, I sat outside the RV with my guitar, strumming idly as the last light faded from the sky. The sound of the rapids was louder now, a constant rush that drowned out the usual nighttime symphony of crickets and frogs. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of inspiration. Maybe this trip wasn't such a bad idea. Then I heard it, a faint giggle like a child's, carried on the wind. I froze, my fingers stilling on the strings. It was faint, almost drowned out by the river, but unmistakable. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No answer, just the river and the faint rustle of leaves. I told myself it was nothing, just an echo or my imagination playing tricks, and went inside to sleep. That night, I dreamed of Jenna. She was standing by the river, her back to me, humming the lullaby she used to sing when we were younger. I tried to call out to her, but no sound came from my lips. When I woke, my cheeks were wet with tears. The next morning, I decided to hike one of the trails that wound along the river. The air was crisp, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden streaks, but the unease from the night before lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About halfway down the trail, I noticed something odd, small footprints in the mud, too small to belong to an adult. They ran alongside my own for a few steps before veering off toward the river. There were no other campers around, and the sight sent a chill down my spine. As I followed the trail, the roar of the rapids grew louder, almost deafening. Then I heard it again, a child's laughter, clear and sharp, cutting through the noise. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called. Again, no answer. Shaking my head, I pressed on, determined to reach the riverbank. When I got there, I found something even stranger, a small, moss-covered doll lying on the rocks. Its face was faded and weathered, but its eyes seemed to glint in the sunlight, almost as if they were watching me. I picked it up, examining it closely. As I turned it over, a faint melody began to play, a music box tune, soft and haunting. My breath caught in my throat. The tune was the same lullaby Jenna used to hum. That evening, I couldn't shake the melody from my head. It felt like the forest was closing in, the shadows growing longer, the air heavier. As I sat in the RV, the music box tune began to play again, faint at first, then louder. I searched the RV, convinced I'd accidentally brought the doll inside, but it wasn't there. The tune stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft knock at the door. I froze. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle and yanked the door open. No one was there, just the empty forest bathed in moonlight. Then I saw them, shadows flitting between the trees. They were small, childlike, moving too quickly to be human. My stomach churned as I realized they were circling the RV. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The RV began to shake as if something, or many somethings, were pounding on the sides. I shouted for them to stop, but the noise only grew louder, the whispers and laughter blending into a chaotic cacophony. Finally, I grabbed my guitar and strummed the first chords that came to mind, playing louder and louder until the shaking stopped. The laughter faded, leaving only the sound of my music and the distant roar of the rapids. The next morning, I knew I had to leave, but something drew me back to the river. I followed the trail again, clutching the doll I'd found. The voices were louder now, calling my name, singing the lullaby in eerie, childlike tones. When I reached the riverbank, the air grew icy and the shadows beneath the trees seemed to ripple like water. "I know you're here," I said, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The voices grew louder and the shadows took shape. 3 children, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark voids. They stared at me, their expressions a mix of sadness and anger. "Help us," they whispered, their voices overlapping in a haunting harmony. "What do you need?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. They pointed to the doll, and in that moment I understood. They were tied to it, bound to the river by whatever tragedy had claimed them. I placed the doll on the ground and stepped back, watching as the children reached for it. But as their hands touched it, their forms began to twist and contort, their whispers turning to wails. The river surged, the rapids crashing violently, and the shadows rushed toward me. I stumbled backward, tripping over the rocks, and ran as fast as I could, the screams echoing in my ears. I left Big Shays that day, vowing never to return. The doll stayed by the river, but the memory of those voices has haunted me ever since. I tried to write about it, to turn it into a piece of music, but every time I play, I hear their whispers in the background. A week after I got home, I found the doll on my porch. Its music box was broken, but sometimes in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear it playing.